There is a city in Western Germany that sits at the exact point where three nations touch, where Belgium fades into the Netherlands and the Netherlands fades into Germany itself. A city so old that its stones remember an emperor who unified a continent more than 1,200 years ago. Charlemagne was crowned here. Holy Roman emperors were crowned here, 30 of them, across 6 centuries. The cathedral at its heart still holds the gilded throne, and in the autumn of 1944, this ancient, sacred, quietly magnificent city was about to be torn apart, block by block, building by building, stone by stone. Welcome. If you are settling in for the night, if you have pulled the blanket a little closer and turned the lights down low, then you have chosen the right place to rest. Tonight we are going to walk through the entire history of the Battle of Aachen, the first major German city to fall to Allied forces in the Second World War. This is a long one, a proper, full-length documentary built for those of you who like your history slow, thorough, and told with the respect it deserves. So get comfortable, let the narration carry you, and if you are new here, take a moment to subscribe before we begin. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to the work we do here. Now, let us go back. By the early autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had taken on a quality that almost defied comprehension. Just 3 months earlier, Allied forces had been confined to the beaches of Normandy, fighting for every meter of sand, every hedgerow, every flooded field. And then something broke. The German line cracked in the late weeks of July, and what followed was not a retreat, it was a rout. American, British, and Canadian forces swept eastward across France at a pace that left supply officers pale and speechless. Paris was liberated. Brussels was liberated. The Allied advance moved so quickly that entire German formations were encircled and destroyed before they could react. Generals who had spent years constructing the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility watched that myth dissolve in a matter of weeks. And then the momentum faltered. It did not stop, but it slowed. Because an army moving that fast outpaces its own fuel, its own ammunition, its own food. The supply lines stretching back to the Normandy beaches were never designed to sustain an advance of this speed or scale. By the time American forces approached the German border in early September, they were still moving, but the sprint was becoming something closer to a steady, determined walk. And it was at this precise moment, when the Allies were powerful but thinning, when the Germans were broken but not gone, that Aachen came into view. The city was not simply a military objective, it was a symbol, the first German city within reach of the Allied advance, the ancient capital of a Frankish emperor whose name, Karl der Grosse, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, still carried weight across the entire Western world. To capture Aachen would be to cross a threshold that Hitler's propaganda machine had spent years insisting could never be crossed. To capture Aachen would be to plant Allied boots on German soil and hold them there. For the Americans pressing forward under General Omar Bradley, it represented the beginning of the end. For the German High Command, and for Hitler himself, it represented something far more dangerous, a crack in the wall of the Reich that, if allowed to widen, could not be repaired. And so Hitler did what Hitler did. He issued orders, extraordinary orders, orders that bore no relationship to the military reality on the ground, but carried with them the full, terrifying weight of Nazi authority. Aachen was designated a fortress city. It would be held. It would not be surrendered. Every soldier in its defense would fight to the last round and the last breath. The commanders who received these orders knew, many of them, that they amounted to a sentence, not a strategy, But in the autumn of 1944, questioning Hitler's directives was not a conversation that ended well. And so the stage was set for something that neither side truly wanted in the way it unfolded. The Americans had not come to Aachen looking for a prolonged siege. They had come expecting, as they had come to expect across those dizzying summer weeks, that momentum and firepower and the sheer moral weight of their advance would carry them through quickly. They were wrong. And the cost of that miscalculation, measured in lives, in weeks, in the physical destruction of an irreplaceable medieval city, would reshape everything that Allied commanders understood about what the road to Berlin was going to require of them. Over the next several hours, we are going to cover all of it. We will begin where Aachen itself begins, with the ancient stones and the strategic geography that made this city unavoidable. We will follow the summer offensive that brought American forces to the German border and trace the precise moment that momentum began to stall. We will sit with the civilians, more than 100,000 of them, who were ordered from their homes into an uncertain autumn, carrying what they could, leaving behind everything they had built. We will walk alongside the German garrison as it dug into the rubble and prepared to do the unthinkable. And we will follow the American soldiers who were asked to clear a city, house by house, cellar by cellar, in one of the most grueling forms of combat that warfare has ever produced. We will talk about the ultimatum that was issued and refused, about the bombardment that followed, about the days and weeks of street fighting that wore down both sides at a rate that no initial plan had accounted for. We will talk about the civilians who survived in tunnels and basements while the city above them ceased to exist, about the German commander who eventually looked at the wreckage around him and made a decision that no Nazi directive gave him permission to make, and about the moment, quiet, almost anticlimactic after so much destruction, when the guns finally stopped. And then we will ask what it all meant, because the fall of Aachen was not simply a military victory, ticked off on a map and moved past. It was a warning, a demonstration that the German military, shattered and retreating as it was, would defend its homeland with a ferocity that the Allied advance had not yet encountered in quite this form. Every week spent taking Aachen was a week that revealed the true shape of what lay ahead. Dozens more cities, hundreds more streets, thousands more rooms, all of them potentially waiting with the same desperate, grinding resistance. The ancient coronation city of Western Europe, the first German city to fall, the battle that changed how the Allies understood the war they were still fighting. This is Aachen. This is its story, and you have got the whole night to hear it. Settle in. There is a city in Western Germany where three nations almost touch. Stand at the right point on its outskirts, and you can see the rolling border country of Belgium to the west, the flat lowlands of the Netherlands to the north, and the dark ridgeline of the German interior rising to the east. The city sits in a shallow basin, cradled by low hills and ancient geology, its streets laid out over centuries of continuous human settlement. Rivers run through it, roads converge on it. Trade routes that predate the written memory of modern Europe all bend, at some point, toward this place. Its name is Aachen, and in the autumn of 1944, it would become the most contested urban ground on Earth. To understand why soldiers would die in its alleyways, why men would fire rifles through the windows of buildings that had stood for 500 years, why an entire army would pour artillery into a city for days without pause, you have to understand what Aachen meant before the war. Not what it meant to generals or politicians or ideologues, though it meant a great deal to all of them, but what it meant in the long, slow sense that only centuries can give a place. Aachen was already old when most European cities were young. Its thermal springs drew Roman legionaries who built bathhouses and garrisons beside the steaming water. Those springs still ran in 1944, still warm beneath the rubble, indifferent to the century unfolding above them. But it was not the Romans who gave Aachen its defining identity. That distinction belongs to a single figure whose shadow stretches across more than 1,000 years of European history. Charlemagne, Karl der Grosse in German, Charles the Great in the broader tradition, chose Aachen as the capital of his Frankish Empire in the 8th century. He built his palace complex here. He built his chapel here, an extraordinary octagonal structure that still stood in 1944, still rising above the rooflines of the surrounding city, its stonework carrying the weight of 11 centuries. Within that chapel, Charlemagne was eventually buried, and for the 300 years following his death, the kings of Germany traveled to Aachen to be crowned. More than 30 of them made that journey, more than 30 coronations in the same stone building over 3 centuries, cementing the city's identity as something more than a place, as a symbol, a legitimizing site, the ground on which European rulers sought to connect themselves to the greatest emperor the continent had produced since Rome fell. This history was not lost on anyone in 1944. It was, in fact, weaponized by both sides. For Nazi Germany, Aachen represented a direct bloodline to Carolingian power, a city that embodied the ancient Germanic claim to European dominance that the Third Reich had spent 12 years trying to resurrect through violence and ideology. German propaganda had spent years invoking Charlemagne, bending his legacy to fit the regime's mythology, presenting the medieval emperor as a proto-Germanic hero whose spirit demanded that Aachen never fall to foreign hands. For the Allies, and particularly for the Americans who would be the ones to actually take the city, Aachen represented something different but equally charged. The threshold, the door, the first major German city that could actually be reached, actually be entered, actually be taken from the German state on German soil. To cross into Aachen was to cross into Germany in a way that meant something beyond the merely geographic. The city's physical position reinforced its psychological weight. Aachen sits at the western edge of a geographic corridor, a natural passage through the hills and river valleys that has funneled armies east and west across this part of Europe for as long as armies have moved across it. The Romans used it, medieval forces used it, 19th century armies used it. The terrain does not offer many alternatives. To the south, the Ardennes forest rises into difficult, compartmented ground that resists large-scale movement. To the north, the Dutch lowlands present their own complications: flooded fields, canals, ground that swallows vehicles and exhausts infantry. But through and around Aachen, the land opens just enough to permit the passage of mechanized forces, supply columns, and the full weight of a modern army pressing eastward. This was not lost on the planners on either side. Aachen was not simply a city. It was a gateway, perhaps the most accessible gateway through which the Western Allies could drive into the German heartland. Beyond the corridor itself, Aachen sits within striking distance of the Ruhr River, and further east, the Rhine. These two water obstacles represented the next great defensive lines available to Germany after the West Wall. The fortified belt of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and prepared positions known to the Allies as the Siegfried line had been breached or bypassed. An Allied force that could establish itself in and around Aachen, that could use the city as a forward base and supply hub, would be positioned to threaten the deeper German interior in ways that went far beyond the tactical. The industrial regions to the east, the communications networks converging on the Rhine crossings, the ability to sustain offensive pressure through the winter. All of these depended, in ways both direct and indirect, on who held Aachen and what they could do with it. By the early days of September 1944, the question of who would hold Aachen had not yet been answered, but the direction of the answer seemed clear enough to almost everyone watching. The German army that had fought in France through the summer had been shattered. Division after division had been encircled, ground down, or simply swept away by the speed and weight of the Allied breakout following the Normandy landings. The great Allied armies had moved east at a pace that surprised even their own commanders, liberating Paris, crossing the Seine, driving through Belgium with a momentum that seemed to compress weeks of expected fighting into days. By early September, forward elements of American forces had crossed into German territory at certain points along the border. The West Wall, which German engineers had spent years fortifying and which German propaganda had presented as an impenetrable barrier, was now being probed, tested, and in some places simply walked through where the garrison had not yet arrived to man it properly. And yet Aachen had not fallen. It sat there in its basin, its ancient cathedral still intact, its streets still largely standing, its population still present in numbers that complicated any military operation around it. The city had not been bypassed, had not been abandoned, had not been simply absorbed by the tide of Allied advance. Partly this was a matter of logistics. The Allied armies had outrun their supply lines in ways that were just beginning to reveal themselves, and the momentum of August could not be sustained indefinitely without fuel, ammunition, and time to consolidate. Partly it was geography. The approaches to Aachen required careful management, with American forces needing to close from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent German forces from slipping away or reinforcing at will. And partly, though the Allied commanders did not yet fully appreciate this, it was a matter of German will. Something was changing in the character of the defense. The fluid retreat that had characterized German operations through France was hardening into something else, something more deliberate, something that looked from the outside like stubbornness, but from the inside felt like ideology. The city's civilian population numbered, before the war and before the early wartime disruptions, in the low hundreds of thousands. By September 1944, that number had already been reduced by years of Allied bombing raids, by wartime evacuations, by the ordinary attrition of a city living inside a war economy for 5 years. But many people remained. They lived in the medieval center, in the residential districts that fanned out from the cathedral and the old market square, in the industrial neighborhoods and the modest terraces of a city that was large enough to be genuinely urban, but not so large as to be anonymous. These were ordinary people, shopkeepers, factory workers, teachers, elderly residents who had lived through the previous war and had no particular desire to experience another one at close range. Most of them did not choose the fight that was coming. The fight was coming regardless. For these civilians, Aachen's identity was not primarily strategic or symbolic. It was the place where they lived. It was the cathedral they walked past on the way to the market. It was the springs they had visited on Sundays, the streets they had learned as children, the buildings their grandparents had known. The weight of Charlemagne's legacy was an abstraction to most of them, a fact in a history book, a bronze statue in a square, a distant pride rather than a daily reality. What was real was their city, their homes, their neighbors, and all of that was now caught between two armies, one ordered to hold the ground to the last man, and one beginning to understand that taking it would cost far more than anyone had expected. In the long accounting of the Second World War, the battle that would unfold in and around Aachen over the following weeks would occupy a particular place. It would be the first major battle fought on German soil. It would be the first major German city to fall to the Western Allies. It would demonstrate, at a cost measured in thousands of lives, that the German military was capable of a quality of urban resistance that transformed every block, every building, every basement into a separate problem requiring its own solution. And it would do all of this in a city that had been waiting for more than 1,000 years at the edge of empire, watching armies come and go across the borderlands, absorbing the consequences of ambition and conflict, enduring. The autumn of 1944 would test that endurance more severely than anything that had come before. The ancient coronation city was about to become a battlefield. It had begun weeks before the first American soldier ever set eyes on Aachen. The stage for that siege, the conditions that would make it possible, and the conditions that would make it so brutally difficult, was built not in the streets of a German city, but in the hedgerows and open fields of northern France, where the summer of 1944 unraveled the Wehrmacht with a speed that stunned even the men doing the unraveling. To understand what was coming, you have to understand what had already happened. You have to go back to the moment the German line didn't just bend, it broke. For weeks after the 6th of June, the Allies had been locked in a grinding, costly struggle across the Normandy countryside. The bocage, that dense network of ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes, had nullified much of the Allied advantage in armour and firepower, reducing the campaign to something that felt closer to the First World War than to the mobile warfare everyone had imagined. German forces, though badly outnumbered and under constant aerial attack, had held their lines with a discipline that cost the Allies dearly. Progress was measured in fields and farm tracks, not in kilometres. Commanders on both sides understood that the stalemate, if it held, could drag on for months. And then, in late July, everything changed at once. The operation that cracked the German front open launched in the final days of that month, punching through German positions near Saint-Lô with concentrated armoured and infantry force. Within days, American tanks were moving not forward in yards, but in miles, swinging south and then east through the French interior. The German command structure, already stretched and battered, struggled to respond. Divisions that had been holding coherent defensive lines found those lines suddenly irrelevant. The Americans were already behind them, around them, cutting off their routes of retreat before orders to withdraw had even been issued. The collapse, when it finally came, had the character of something that had been held together by sheer will for too long. Once it started, it accelerated. By early August, entire German formations were encircled in the Falaise pocket, a catastrophic trap from which tens of thousands of men could not escape. The fighting inside that pocket was savage and desperate, as compressed German units attempted to break through Allied lines while Allied artillery and aircraft worked methodically to reduce everything within reach. Some units escaped. Many did not. Equipment was abandoned on a staggering scale. Tanks, artillery pieces, horses, supply vehicles, left in the lanes and fields of Normandy in numbers that represented months of German industrial effort. The Wehrmacht that emerged from Falaise was a fraction of what had entered it, shattered in morale as much as in men and materiel. For a force that had spent years presenting itself as invincible, the psychological damage was incalculable. What followed was unlike almost anything seen in the European theatre. Allied formations, suddenly free of the bocage and the grinding attritional combat it had imposed, erupted eastward across France at a pace that outran the ability of German commanders to form new defensive lines. American and British armoured columns covered distances in a single day that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. The roads of France were clogged, not with orderly military traffic, but with the wreckage of a retreating army. Burned vehicles, discarded equipment, and columns of dazed prisoners being herded westward. French civilians, emerging from years of occupation, lined the roadways in their thousands. There were scenes of jubilation unlike anything Europe had witnessed since the war began, and amid that jubilation, the Allied spearheads kept moving, kept probing east, following the momentum wherever it led. Paris fell in late August. The liberation of the French capital carried an emotional weight that transcended the purely military. This was not a crossroads town or a supply depot, but one of the great cities of Western civilization, and its return to Allied hands sent a signal across the continent. German forces in the city, despite orders to reduce it to rubble before surrendering, did not carry out that destruction. Whether from strategic calculation or simple human restraint, the city survived largely intact. For the Allies, it was a moment of immense symbolic power, a confirmation that the war's tide had turned so completely that even the Wehrmacht's most fanatical impulses could be outrun. The question now was not whether Germany would be defeated, but how much longer it would take. That question began to grow complicated almost immediately. The speed of the Allied advance, so exhilarating in those late summer weeks, was consuming something at a rate no supply system had been designed to sustain. Fuel, gasoline, in quantities that defied easy imagination, was the lifeblood of armored advance, and the distances now separating Allied columns from their supply depots back near the Normandy beaches were becoming genuinely critical. Trucks ran day and night in organized convoys, attempting to push supplies forward, but the math was relentless. The faster the armies moved, the farther they got from their logistics base, and the harder it became to keep the momentum alive. Some commanders received urgent warnings that their formations might grind to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because of empty fuel tanks. The Germans, meanwhile, were doing something the Allies had perhaps not anticipated fully. They were using the time bought by Allied supply difficulties to do what armies do when they are given any breathing room at all. They were reorganizing. Scattered units were gathered, reconstituted, and pushed into new positions. Replacement troops were moved forward. Officers who had survived the catastrophe in France were assigned to commands they would never have received under normal circumstances, and they brought with them whatever hard-won experience the summer's disaster had left them. The Wehrmacht was battered, yes. It was depleted, undersupplied, and operating under a command structure that Hitler's interference had made increasingly dysfunctional. But it was not yet broken beyond function, not quite. As September opened, the Allied advance reached a frontier that carried a weight unlike any they had crossed before. This was not France, not Belgium, not Luxembourg. This was the border of Germany itself. For Allied soldiers who had fought their way across hundreds of kilometers of occupied Europe, crossing into German territory meant something. The enemy was now defending his own soil. The calculations that might govern a French or Belgian soldier's willingness to fight, calculations about liberation versus futile sacrifice, did not apply here in the same way. German soldiers defending German land, with German towns and German families behind them, would fight differently than they had at Falaise or in the Bocage. Everyone understood this, even if no one said it plainly. Near Aachen, American units began approaching territory that would have been unimaginable as a battleground even 3 months earlier. The city sat at the junction where Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany converged, a geographic node whose significance was as much historical as it was military. Allied commanders understood that pushing through this area meant breaching the West Wall, the network of fortifications Germany had constructed along its western border in the years before the war. The West Wall, sometimes called the Siegfried Line by Allied soldiers, had been partially stripped of men and equipment earlier in the war, when confidence in the Wehrmacht's offensive capability had made it seem unnecessary. Now those defences, inadequate as they were, represented the last prepared obstacle before the German interior. Both sides knew what was at stake in piercing them. The mood within American formations as they approached this frontier was genuinely complex. There was exhaustion. Weeks of combat and movement had ground men down in ways that even victory could not entirely mask. There was also something close to disbelief that they had come so far so fast, that the summer which had begun with the awful uncertainty of the Normandy beaches had ended with American boots on German soil. Some commanders still harbored the hope that the German collapse would continue, that the Wehrmacht might simply disintegrate before the onslaught the way the summer's campaign had suggested it could. Others, more cautious, watched the German positions near Aachen taking shape and felt something different. A slowing, a hardening, the sense that whatever had been collapsing across France was finding, here on its own ground, a reason to stop. That instinct was correct, and the weeks ahead would prove it in the most costly way imaginable. The momentum that had swept the Allies across France in breathless, exhilarating weeks was faltering. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a tide falters almost imperceptibly at first, before the retreat becomes undeniable. What was waiting near Aachen was not another falaise, not another open-field rout. It was something the Allied armies had not yet truly faced on this campaign, a determined urban defence, ordered to hold at all costs, in a city whose streets and stones and ancient walls would become a killing ground, unlike anything the summer's swift advance had prepared them for. The road to Germany had looked, for a few brilliant weeks, like it might run straight and fast to Berlin. At Aachen, it was about to stop, and turn, and descend into something far darker. By the autumn of 1944, Adolf Hitler was no longer a man who accepted the advice of his generals. He had never been comfortable with it, but the disasters of the preceding months, the collapse in France, the obliteration of Army Group Center in the east, the loss of Romania and its oil fields, had driven him deeper into a psychology of denial that his inner circle no longer dared to challenge. When the front near Aachen began to buckle, and reports filtered into the Führerhauptquartier of American armored columns approaching the German border, Hitler did not respond by ordering a measured tactical withdrawal to defensible ground. He responded by reaching for the only tool left in his diminishing arsenal of conviction, the word fortress. It was a word that had done tremendous damage to the Wehrmacht already. Stalingrad had been a fortress. Cherbourg had been a fortress. One by one, these designated strongholds had consumed German manpower, materiel, and irreplaceable time, and one by one they had fallen. Now Hitler fixed his gaze on a Roman city at the western edge of his crumbling empire, and declared that it too would hold. The fortress directive that descended on Aachen's defenders was not born of careful operational planning or sound military logic. It emerged from the same compulsive reflex that had governed Hitler's strategic decisions since the first reversal on the Eastern Front years earlier, the belief that willpower, expressed as a written order, could substitute for reserves, supply lines, and rational positioning. The directive designated Aachen a Festung, a fortress city, carrying with it a specific set of obligations under the Nazi command structure. A fortress city was not merely to be defended, it was to be held unconditionally, its garrison bound by oath and ideology to resist until the last possible moment. Commanders who received fortress designations understood implicitly that retreat was no longer a military option but a criminal act. The men assigned to hold such places were, in the coldest possible reading of the situation, being written off before the first shot was fired in anger. What made Hitler's order particularly destructive was not the designation itself, but the resources he attached to it, or rather, failed to attach. A genuine fortress defense requires pre-positioned supplies, reinforced infrastructure, reliable communication lines, and a garrison large enough to absorb casualties and rotate units through the worst of the fighting. Aachen had none of these things in adequate measure. The city's peacetime population had already begun flowing westward in panic, and the military infrastructure available to its defenders was a patchwork of improvised positions, aging fortifications left over from earlier periods of the war, and whatever the Wehrmacht could scrape together from an army already fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. Hitler's directive created the obligation to hold Aachen without providing the means to do so. It was a prescription written by a man who had long since confused determination with capability. The Wehrmacht's senior commanders in the West received the fortress order with the careful, exhausted compliance that had become the standard posture of German generalship by this stage of the war. Field Marshal Walther Model, commanding Army Group B, was among the most capable German commanders still operational in the West, a man known for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts and extract coherent defensive formations from chaos. But even Model understood that Hitler's directives carried a dual character. They were military orders and they were political documents simultaneously, and questioning them too forcefully carried consequences that had nothing to do with battlefield outcomes. Model would do what he could to rationalize the resources available, but he could not conjure divisions from nothing, and the fortress order gave him no additional means to honor its demands. He worked within the constraints, knowing the math did not favor the city. What compounded the confusion was that the fortress directive arrived alongside a separate and fundamentally contradictory current of operational thinking emanating from Hitler's headquarters. Even as orders flowed westward demanding that Aachen be held at all costs, other staff conversations were already circling around the concept that would eventually become the Ardennes offensive, the great counterattack that Hitler believed could split the Allied line and recapture Antwerp, reversing the entire strategic situation in the West in a single bold stroke. These two ideas, the static defense of a fortress city and the accumulation of armored reserves for a strategic counteroffensive, required completely different distributions of manpower and materiel. They could not be pursued simultaneously with the resources available. Yet Hitler refused to acknowledge the contradiction. Commanders in the field received pressure from both directions at once, urged to defend every street in Aachen, while also being told that relief forces and counterattack formations were being assembled just behind the lines. The practical effect of this contradiction on German unit commanders in and around Aachen was a kind of operational paralysis, dressed in the language of aggressive intent. Officers who might have positioned their forces for a flexible defense, trading space for time, preserving strength for later engagements, instead found themselves locked into static positions by the fortress designation, unable to maneuver without explicit authorization that rarely came, and when it did, sometimes arrived too late to be useful. Regimental and battalion commanders operated in an environment where the punishment for unauthorized withdrawal was severe enough to eliminate any instinct toward tactical initiative. The Wehrmacht had always valued aggressive, independent decision-making at the lower command levels. It had been one of the German army's genuine strengths in the early years of the war. Hitler's fortress culture systematically dismantled that strength, replacing it with rigid obedience to orders that the men at the front could see were disconnected from the reality in front of them. Into this already fractured command environment came the reinforcements, such as they were. Units dispatched toward Aachen from other sectors of the front arrived piecemeal, often depleted before they even reached their assigned positions. Some formations were pulled from the Eastern Front, men who had been fighting almost without pause for months, and who arrived in the West exhausted, under-equipped, and unfamiliar with the terrain they were being asked to defend. Others were assembled from rear area troops, administrative personnel, and training formations, soldiers whose value was theoretical rather than tested. Volkssturm units, the militia of last resort, that the Nazi Party was now pressing into uniform regardless of age or fitness, began appearing in the defensive calculations. These were men, and in some cases boys and elderly men, who were handed weapons they had sometimes never fired and told to stand against one of the most experienced armies in the world. Hitler's order had created a garrison on paper. The reality on the ground was something considerably more fragile. The psychological atmosphere generated by the fortress designation was itself a form of operational damage. Senior German officers who understood the situation clearly, who could read a map and calculate supply rates, and estimate how long a garrison of the size available could realistically hold against determined American assault, had no legitimate channel through which to communicate their assessments upward without risking their careers, or worse. The culture of the Führerhauptquartier by this period of the war was one in which pessimism had been criminalized. Generals who offered honest assessments of deteriorating situations had been relieved, humiliated, or worse. The officers who survived were those who had learned to package reality in language that Hitler could accept, which meant that the information reaching the top of the German command structure had been filtered, softened, and optimized for palatability rather than accuracy. Hitler's decisions were, in a very real sense, responses to a war that no longer existed. Yet there was one dimension of the fortress order that its recipients understood with grim clarity, even through all the ideological noise surrounding it. Aachen had symbolic value that transcended its military importance. This was not simply a communications hub or a logistical waypoint. This was the city of Charlemagne, the ancient seat of the Holy Roman Empire, a place whose name carried weight in the German national consciousness far beyond its practical significance on a military map. Losing Aachen, the first major German city to fall to an invading Western force, would be a psychological event of the first order, a signal to the German population and to the watching world that the Reich's frontier had been breached. Hitler understood this acutely, and it drove his insistence on the fortress designation as much as any military calculation. The city was not primarily a defensive position, it was a symbol, and symbols, in Hitler's war, were worth any number of lives. The fortress order therefore accomplished something that straightforward military logic never could have. It transformed a city that might otherwise have been bypassed or captured with limited resistance into a killing ground. By locking the German garrison in place and forbidding any rational adjustment of the defensive lines, the directive ensured that whatever forces were committed to Aachen would remain there, fighting and dying, until the position was either relieved or annihilated. Since relief was never realistically coming, the forces notionally earmarked for it were needed elsewhere, were slower to assemble than promised, and were ultimately absorbed into other priorities. Annihilation was, from the very moment the order was issued, the probable outcome. The Wehrmacht soldiers who took their positions in Aachen's streets and cellars in September of 1944 were, without knowing it, already trapped by a decision made far above their pay grade in a headquarters that no longer had meaningful contact with the war being fought. What followed from all of this? The fragmented command structure, the contradictory directives, the inadequate garrison, dressed in the rhetoric of an invincible fortress, was not a coherent military defense. It was the performance of one. Orders were issued, positions were designated, commanders were appointed, and the machinery of Wehrmacht bureaucracy ground forward with impressive-looking activity. But underneath the organizational language, the fortress of Aachen rested on foundations that were already cracked. The men who would be asked to hold it knew this, in the wordless way that soldiers always know the difference between a plan and a promise. They would fight because orders demanded it, because ideology demanded it, because the men on either side of them were watching, and because the alternative carried consequences too terrible to contemplate. But fighting and winning are different things, and the fortress directive had ensured that only one of them was still possible in Aachen. The Americans were still approaching through the autumn rain, when the city's fate was already, in the most important sense, decided. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes only after weeks of unbroken forward motion. By the time the American First Army approached the German border in the opening days of September 1944, that confidence had become something close to intoxication. The men had crossed France at a pace that defied the logic of modern warfare. They had watched enemy formations dissolve in the road dust ahead of them, had rolled through cheering towns, had slept in fields where 2 weeks prior German soldiers had eaten their rations and sharpened their bayonets. The momentum of an entire campaign had gathered itself into something almost physical, a pressure bearing down on the Reich from the west, and now, at last, the first edges of Germany itself were coming into view. The border was not a wall or a wire. It was, in many places, simply a road sign. But for the men of the First Army, seeing it meant something that no briefing document could fully prepare a soldier for. They were crossing into the enemy's home ground, and even the most battle-hardened among them understood instinctively that something was about to change. General Omar Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group at this point in the campaign, a formation of immense power stretching across a broad front from Luxembourg north toward the Dutch border. Within that structure, it was General Courtney Hodges who held direct command of the First Army, and it fell to Hodges and his subordinates to carry the advance into the sector around Aachen. Hodges was a precise and methodical man, shaped by decades of military experience into something that looked from the outside almost like calm. He did not speak in grand pronouncements. He worked through maps, through logistics, through the careful movement of formations against terrain. He trusted the process of soldiering more than he trusted inspiration, and in that respect he was exactly the kind of commander the First Army needed as it transitioned from the open road sprint of the summer into something altogether more complex. What he could not yet fully see, as September opened and his forces moved toward the ancient city on the German border, was that the terrain ahead was going to demand far more than methodology alone. Supporting and shaping the approach to Aachen was the 19th Corps, commanded by General Charles Corlett, a figure whose profile in popular memory is smaller than his operational role deserves. Corlett had fought in the Pacific before returning to the European theatre, and he brought with him a particular appreciation for the difficulties of reducing fixed defensive positions in confined ground. His corps would bear a significant share of the weight in the coming weeks, managing the flow of forces toward and eventually around the city in an operation that would grow considerably more complicated than anyone at 19th Corps headquarters was yet anticipating. In those first September days, however, the planning remained rooted in the assumptions of the summer. The Germans were running. They had been running since Normandy. The natural operational logic said they would keep running. That assumption was not unreasonable. Everything the American commanders had seen across France supported it. The Wehrmacht had been shattered in the Falaise pocket in August. losing tens of thousands of men and equipment on a scale that should have required months to replace. Armored formations that had once made the German military machine so fearsome were now limping eastward with a fraction of their original strength. The Luftwaffe was largely absent from the skies over the front. German morale, as measured by the rate of surrender and desertion, had declined dramatically over the course of the summer campaign. Prisoners taken during the August fighting described units in disorder, officers contradicting one another, supply systems that had broken down entirely. The intelligence picture that arrived on First Army desks suggested a broken force falling back on its last reserves. Nothing in that picture pointed unmistakably toward what Aachen would actually become. Yet even within the intelligence assessments, there were signals that deserved closer attention. Certain German units had shown flashes of fierce local resistance before withdrawing, buying time with small actions that seemed out of proportion to their tactical value. Border zones that German forces might have abandoned without a fight were instead being held, however briefly, by troops who appeared not to have received the general instruction to collapse. And Aachen itself sat at a crossing point of immense historical and symbolic weight, the kind of place that wars have always caused men to fight over beyond what military rationality alone would dictate. The city had been the seat of Charlemagne's empire, the coronation ground of German kings across more than 6 centuries, the ancient heart of a tradition that Nazi propaganda had claimed as its own ideological inheritance. That the regime in Berlin would view Aachen's loss differently from the loss of Amiens or Orléans was something that might have been anticipated. In the rush of the summer advance, it was not given the weight it deserved. American planning in those early September days proceeded on the assumption that the drive toward Aachen was one segment of a broader eastward push, not a campaign in its own right. The intent was to reach and cross the Siegfried line, the defensive fortifications the Germans called the West Wall, and continue into the Rhine Valley beyond. Aachen was a waypoint in that geography, not a destination. It sat astride routes that the First Army needed, and capturing it would deny the Germans a significant logistical and communications hub. But few in the American command structure were yet thinking of it as a city to be besieged. The vocabulary of the planning was still the vocabulary of maneuver. Reach the objective, secure it, press forward. That was how the summer had worked. That was how the soldiers and their commanders understood the war they were fighting. The men who would carry out those plans were, by September, veterans in the true sense of that word. Not the polished veteran of peacetime imagination, but the lean and watchful kind, men who had learned to read ground and silence and the way other soldiers moved. The divisions approaching Aachen had fought in the hedgerows of Normandy, which had been a brutal school in ways the training camps of Britain could never have replicated. They understood the cost of urban ground the way a man understands pain after having experienced it directly. And yet the summer of movement had, in a way, begun to soften those memories. When you have been advancing for weeks, when the enemy is retreating every morning before you arrive, the muscle memory of attritional fighting recedes. The soldiers approaching Aachen were confident, seasoned, and not nearly afraid enough of what was waiting for them. That is not a criticism. It is simply what forward momentum does to the human mind. Supply was already beginning to create friction that the maps did not show. The American advance across France had been so rapid and so deep that the logistical system feeding it was being stretched past its designed tolerances. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment were moving forward along routes that grew longer every day, and the allocation of those resources across the front was becoming a source of tension both within the American command and between American and British formations. Aachen was not yet consuming supplies, it had not yet been assigned. But the broader context of the campaign meant that when the city did begin to demand more than anyone had planned for, the system would feel the strain in ways that reached back hundreds of kilometers to the coast. None of that was visible from the forward positions in early September. The trucks were still arriving, the artillery was still moving up, the tempo still felt manageable. General Hodges and his staff were working in a command environment that demanded constant choices about where to focus attention. The First Army's front was wide, and its commitments were multiple. Aachen was important, but so were the approaches to the north, the coordination with British formations on the left flank, and the question of what German forces might be doing in the rough Ardennes country to the south. The Aachen problem was real and recognized, but it competed for command attention with a dozen other problems of roughly equal apparent urgency. This is the ordinary texture of army command in a major campaign, not the clean, singular focus of hindsight, but the simultaneous management of overlapping uncertainties. Decisions get made with incomplete information, weighted against other decisions being made with equally incomplete information, and the consequences travel forward in time until they become history. What neither Hodges nor Corlett nor Bradley could know in those early September days was that Hitler's Fortress Directive had already changed the nature of the problem they were moving toward. The order from Berlin had not yet fully filtered down to every German unit in the Aachen sector, and the effects of it would take time to become visible in the tactical behavior of the defenders. But the decision had been made at the highest level of the Reich that Aachen would not be given up. Reinforcements were being directed toward the city even as other parts of the German front bent and fractured. Engineers were being set to work on fortifications. A garrison was being assembled and assigned a commander whose orders would prove to be non-negotiable until the very last days of the battle. All of that was taking shape invisibly, behind the rubble and the tree lines and the first German defensive positions that American scouts were beginning to encounter as September wore on. The approach to Aachen, then, carried within it a gap between American assumption and German reality that would take weeks of fighting to close. The Americans came expecting a door that would open. The Germans had spent those same weeks welding it shut, bolting it from the inside, and piling everything they had against the frame. The city that Charlemagne had made the center of his world was about to become the center of something far darker. A siege conducted in rubble, street by street and room by room, at a cost in lives and time and material that no one in the First Army had written into their September planning. But that reckoning was still ahead. In the first days of the month, the soldiers moved east, the supply trucks moved east, the maps were unfolded and marked and folded again, and everything still looked, from a certain distance, like it was going to plan. Before the first shell ever fell on Aachen, before the first American boot touched German soil in anger, the city was already dying, not from bombardment, not from battle, but from the inside out, emptied by its own government, stripped of its people in a chaotic, desperate tide that flowed westward and southward along every road out of the city. The evacuation of Aachen was not a humanitarian gesture. It was a military calculation, cold and deliberate, dressed in the language of protection and duty while serving only the machinery of war. More than 100,000 people, families, the elderly, children barely old enough to understand what was happening, were told to gather what they could carry and leave the place their families had called home for generations. They were given hours, not days, and the city they left behind was already being consumed by something that had nothing to do with them. The order to evacuate did not arrive cleanly or with adequate preparation. There was no organized convoy waiting, no clear destination announced, no certainty about where displaced families should go or who would feed them when they arrived. Nazi Party officials, the Gauleiter and his subordinates, moved through neighborhoods with megaphones and written notices, declaring the city a military zone and ordering civilians out. For many, the announcement came as both shock and confirmation of a fear they had quietly carried for weeks. They had watched the summer unfold on their radios and in whispered conversations, the Normandy landings in June, the collapse of the German line in France, the extraordinary Allied speed that had swallowed Paris whole and now pressed against the borders of the Reich itself. They had told themselves it could not come here. Now it had come, and the men with armbands and insignia were telling them to leave before it arrived in force. What followed in the streets of Aachen was something between a mass migration and a breakdown of civic order. Families loaded handcarts and bicycles with whatever they could reach first: clothing, food, photographs, documents, the things that seemed essential in the first minutes of panic and then grew impossibly heavy within the first kilometer. Old women who had survived the previous war walked alongside young mothers carrying infants, alongside men too old or too infirm for military service who now found themselves cast adrift from everything familiar. The roads leading out of the city filled with this slow, shuffling tide, and the German military found itself simultaneously trying to move troops into the city as civilians streamed out of it in the opposite direction. The two flows tangled and slowed each other, creating bottlenecks on bridges and intersections that frustrated commanders on both sides of the equation. There was a category of resident who could not leave easily, and their situation would prove the most desperate of all. The sick lay in hospital beds that could not be quickly moved. The very elderly, some too frail to walk more than a short distance, sat in chairs and doorways and watched their neighbors disappear down the road. Some families refused to go, convinced that the reports of Allied approach were exaggerated, or that the German military would hold the line before combat ever reached the city center. Others were simply too poor, too isolated, or too confused by the rapidity of events to organize themselves in time. And some stayed because they had nowhere to go, no relatives in the countryside, no money for lodging, no certainty that the road out was any safer than the building they had sheltered in all their lives. These were the people who would inherit the siege. As the civilian population thinned, the Nazi Party apparatus moved quickly to consolidate its grip on what remained. Buildings were requisitioned not with polite notices, but with immediate authority. A family might return home from a neighbor's house to find Wehrmacht soldiers already moving furniture into the street to make room for a machine gun position or an ammunition cache. Cellars were assessed for their defensive potential. Schools and civic buildings were converted into barracks or command posts. The cathedral, that ancient structure which had survived so many centuries, stood at the center of a city being hollowed out and remade for violence. Every building that remained standing was evaluated not for its historical value or its human function, but for what it offered a defender with a rifle. The requisitioning process revealed a deeper truth about what the Nazi regime understood by the word protection. The state was not protecting Aachen's people by sending them down those crowded roads. It was protecting its ability to use Aachen as a military object. The city's centuries of history, the memory of Charlemagne's coronation hall, the ancient thermal baths, the layered streets that had accumulated human meaning across 1,000 years. None of this featured in the military calculations being made in those days. What mattered was fields of fire, defensible corners, the depth of a cellar wall, the angle at which a street ran relative to the expected American axis of advance. The city was being consumed by a purely functional logic, that had no room for everything it had ever meant. Among those who remained in Aachen as the evacuation ebbed and the military presence swelled, a strange new daily existence took shape. Small communities of civilians who had stayed behind, by choice or by circumstance, began organizing themselves in the deeper cellars and tunnels that ran beneath the older parts of the city. They shared food, pooled information, tried to calculate from the sound of distant artillery how close the front had come and in which direction it was moving. Some of these groups numbered only a handful of families. Others were larger, more organized, with individuals who had some medical knowledge or practical skill emerging as informal leaders of their underground communities. They had no reliable information, no clear sense of when or whether rescue would come, and only the sounds above them to interpret. The German military authorities made limited provision for those who stayed. There were announcements that civilians should shelter in designated locations, that they would be protected, that the garrison would hold. These announcements were made with the full authority of the regime and the full certainty of people who had not yet confronted the arithmetic of what was coming. A garrison dug into the rubble of a city, surrounded by an advancing army with overwhelming firepower, could not simultaneously defend military positions and protect the people living beneath those same streets. The two commitments were irreconcilable, and it was the civilian population that would pay for the contradiction. Across those weeks of transition, from occupied city to designated fortress, from populated urban center to prepared killing ground, something irreversible happened to Aachen. The social fabric that had held it together, the routines of commerce and community and daily life, dissolved almost completely. Shops closed, postal service stopped. The bakeries that had served the same neighborhoods for decades went dark and silent. Streets that had been full of ordinary movement, children walking to school, workers heading to shifts, the small transactions of a functioning city, became empty corridors where soldiers moved in tactical formations, and the sound of hammering and digging replaced everything that had come before. It was not a transformation, it was an erasure. The people who had been evacuated carried Aachen with them in memory and in loss, scattered across the surrounding countryside and the towns further east, sleeping in schools and church halls and the spare rooms of distant relatives. They could not know what was happening to the place they had left. They could only wait and listen to the sound of war moving eastward, knowing that somewhere behind them, the city of their lives was being prepared for destruction. The ones who stayed knew it too, in a more immediate and physical way, listening from their cellars to the boots and the machinery above them, to the muffled voices of soldiers speaking in the harsh cadence of men expecting combat. Both groups, those who fled and those who remained, were hostages to decisions made by men who would never sleep in those cellars or walk those emptied streets. What the evacuation ultimately produced was not safety. It produced a division of suffering. Those who left would face months of displacement, poverty, and uncertainty before any return became possible. Those who stayed would face the full intensity of what came next: the bombardment, the street fighting, the collapse of every physical structure around them, with no protection beyond the thickness of a cellar wall and whatever reserves of endurance they could locate within themselves. The German state had promised both groups that it was acting in their interest. It had acted, as it consistently had throughout the war, entirely in its own. The city stood hollowed and fortified, its streets emptying into silence, as the American guns grew closer with each passing day. Aachen had been cleared for war, and war, with all the weight and fury it carried in the autumn of 1944, was already on the road. While the last civilians stumbled out of Aachen with their bundled possessions and hollow eyes, another kind of work began inside the city they left behind. German engineers moved through the emptying streets with purpose and cold efficiency, reading the urban terrain the way a surgeon reads an anatomy chart, identifying every artery, every choke point, every cavity that could be turned into a weapon. Buildings that had stood for centuries as homes and churches and municipal offices were now assessed purely by their defensive value. A corner apartment block became a firing platform, a cellar became a command post, a ruined wall became a barricade. The process was methodical, deliberate, and utterly indifferent to what the city had been before. It was becoming a killing ground, and the men tasked with shaping it worked around the clock to make it as lethal as possible. The defensive architecture that emerged was not improvised. It followed a logic refined from years of German military doctrine and bitter experience on the Eastern Front. Engineers established what amounted to a layered defensive ring around the city, each ring designed to slow an attacker, funnel him into prepared kill zones, and force him to bleed for every meter gained. The outermost ring relied on natural terrain features, anti-tank ditches, and wire obstacles reinforced with minefields. Closer to the city center, the defensive positions thickened, windows bricked up to firing slits, ground floors of apartment blocks converted into fortified strongpoints, and corridors through rubble deliberately collapsed to channel infantry into narrow lanes where even a small number of defenders could exact devastating cost. Cellars were connected by breached walls, creating subterranean passages that allowed defenders to shift positions without exposing themselves to fire from the street. The city's own bones were being reshaped into a weapon. Command of this fortress, such as it was, fell to Colonel Gerhard Wilk. He was not the kind of figure that propaganda posters celebrated, not a decorated panzer commander or a celebrated general with a string of victories. Wilk was a professional soldier of the German army, competent and experienced, handed a mission that any honest assessment would have recognized as catastrophic from the outset. He knew what was coming. Any man with functioning eyes and access to operational maps could see the weight of Allied forces pressing toward the German border, could see the state of the units at his disposal, could do the arithmetic and reach an uncomfortable conclusion. Yet orders were orders, and in the autumn of 1944, orders from Berlin were backed not merely by military hierarchy, but by the very real threat of summary execution for any officer who deviated from them. Wilk set about organizing his garrison with the professionalism his rank demanded, even as the strategic picture around him told a story with only one ending. The force Wilk commanded was an extraordinary and deeply troubling mixture of military experience and political desperation. At its core sat a body of Wehrmacht regulars, infantrymen, engineers, and support troops who had lived through earlier campaigns and carried genuine combat skill. These men understood fire and movement, knew how to use rubble and shadow, and could be counted on to hold a position under pressure. But around this core, the garrison had been padded with formations that told a darker story about Germany's condition in the autumn of 1944. Hitler Youth units, boys, some barely into their teenage years, had been swept into the defensive roster with rifles placed in hands that had not yet finished growing. They had been raised on a diet of ideological certainty and physical courage as duty, which made them simultaneously formidable in their willingness and heartbreaking in their innocence of what combat would actually cost them. The Volkssturm filled out the garrison's numbers in ways that stretched the word soldier to its outermost limits. These were men conscripted from the civilian population, fathers, grandfathers, men too old or physically unfit for regular military service, men who had spent the war working in factories or managing businesses, and who now found themselves handed a weapon and pointed toward a defensive line. Some had served in the First World War, a conflict more than a quarter-century gone, and whatever skills they carried from that experience had long since calcified. Others had no meaningful military training whatsoever. They were organized into units, given orders, and expected to fight. That many of them would in fact fight, driven by a combination of genuine fear for their homes and families, ideological conviction, or simply the terror of what would happen to them if they did not, said something profound and grim about the depths to which Germany had sunk in its capacity to wage war. And then there were the SS elements. They occupied a different moral category entirely, hardened ideological warriors who had absorbed the cruelest lessons of years on the Eastern Front and who regarded no retreat orders not as a burden but as a creed. Within the garrison, SS officers and soldiers served not merely as combat troops but as enforcers, the internal police force that ensured no unit wavered, no officer contemplated surrender, no ordinary soldier decided that survival outweighed ideology. Their presence throughout the garrison had a chilling effect on any discussion of practical military reality. A Wehrmacht officer who privately understood that the position was hopeless could not easily say so with an SS counterpart in the room. The garrison was held together not purely by military discipline, but by a structure of ideological coercion that ran from Berlin all the way down to individual fighting positions. Wilkes' roughly 5,000 men, the precise figure shifted as reinforcements trickled in and early casualties were sustained, were distributed across the defensive rings according to the quality and capability of each formation. The most experienced Wehrmacht regulars anchored the critical strongpoints, the elevated positions, the key intersections, the buildings that commanded the longest fields of fire. Volkssturm units were placed in secondary positions where their lack of training would be partly compensated by the defensive advantages of the terrain. Hitler Youth were assigned roles where their energy and recklessness might be channeled into short, violent defensive actions rather than the sustained, disciplined fire and movement that required professional soldiers. It was a careful allocation of limited resources, and Wilk oversaw it with the systematic attention of a man who understood that every decision about placement and priority would have consequences measured in lives. The physical fortification work continued day and night during the brief window before American forces arrived in strength. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the approaches most likely to carry Allied armor, placed at angles that maximized their fields of fire and minimized their exposure to counter-battery fire. Machine gun nests were established in upper floors and at ground level simultaneously, creating interlocking fields of fire that would cover one another. Snipers were positioned in elevated rubble, in church towers, in any vantage point that offered a clean line of sight down a street or across an open square. The engineering units breached internal walls between adjacent buildings so that defenders could move laterally within a block without stepping into the open, a technique borrowed from the brutal urban fighting on the Eastern Front, where such methods had ground down attacking forces to exhausted remnants. Every lesson from every urban battle the German army had fought was being applied to Aachen's streets. Supplies were cached throughout the defensive positions, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and water stored in cellars and bunkers to ensure that even if a position became isolated, it could sustain resistance for days. German commanders understood that one of the defining vulnerabilities in urban defense was the interdiction of supply lines, and they worked to pre-position everything the garrison would need before the encirclement that they privately knew was coming. The supply caches would prove crucial in the weeks ahead. allowing pockets of resistance to sustain themselves far longer than an attacker expecting a swift collapse might have anticipated. Every extra day of resistance was, in the calculus of Berlin, a political and psychological victory, regardless of its military cost. There was a particular cruelty embedded in the logic of Aachen's fortification that deserves to be named plainly. The city was being prepared for destruction with the deliberate intent of making that destruction as costly as possible for the attacker. But the city was not a military installation. It was a place where people had lived for generations, where history had accumulated in stone and timber and cobblestone, where the daily rhythms of an ordinary urban population had played out across centuries. Every building turned into a strongpoint was a building that would be destroyed. Every street mined was a street that would have to be fought over in close combat. The defenders were not saving Aachen, they were ensuring its comprehensive ruin, and the orders that mandated this outcome came from men who would face none of its consequences personally. They would issue directives from distant headquarters while Aachen burned. Colonel Wilk surveyed what his garrison had built with the eyes of a soldier who had been told to hold at all costs, and who understood, at some level he could not have expressed without risking his own life, that the cost in question would be measured not in tactical setbacks, but in wholesale destruction. The city that Charlemagne had made the heart of an empire, the city where German kings had been crowned for centuries, the city that carried in its stones the weight of a civilization, was now a fortress. Its defenders waited in the rubble and the darkness of their fortified cellars, in the bricked-up rooms and the connecting tunnels, in the sniper nests and the anti-tank positions. They waited for the Americans to come, and in the second week of September 1944, the Americans were already at the edge of the city, probing the perimeter, beginning to understand what had been prepared for them in those silent, fortified streets. The summer of 1944 had rewritten the rules of warfare in Western Europe. The Allies had shattered the German army in France, pouring out of their Normandy beachhead with a violence and momentum that seemed unstoppable. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of liberated territory, but the sheer weight of American and British forces continued forward without pause, crushing resistance wherever it formed. By the second week of September, as summer turned toward autumn and the days began to shorten imperceptibly, the forward units of General Omar Bradley's First Army were approaching something no American had yet encountered in Europe, the border of Germany itself. For 4 years, the war had been waged on foreign soil, in French villages and Belgian towns. Now, for the first time, American soldiers would set foot on German territory, and with it came a psychological shift that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. The enemy was retreating toward home, toward the Reich, and the nature of resistance was beginning to change in ways that intelligence officers and strategic planners had only begun to comprehend. General Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army, a taciturn Texan whose quiet competence had earned him the respect of his subordinates and the confidence of his superiors. Under his authority, the 19th Corps under General Charles Corlett had been tasked with the northern thrust of the American advance, their objective lying along the German border in the region where 3 nations converged: Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. Intelligence reports spoke of a German garrison at Aachen, a city of roughly 200,000 people, ancient and storied, the place where emperors had once been crowned and where German history ran deep into the medieval past. But American planners in mid-September viewed Aachen less as a symbol and more as a geographic obstacle, a city that lay in the path of advance and would need to be bypassed or rapidly cleared. The assumption, almost universal among American commanders at this moment, was that German forces were in complete disarray, that the Wehrmacht was a broken force capable only of rearguard actions and delaying tactics. Speed, they believed, would be the master key. Push forward before German defences could reform, strike at a pace the enemy could not match. Aachen, in this calculus, was merely another objective in a long chain of advances that would ultimately carry American forces to the Rhine and beyond. What American commanders did not know, what their intelligence networks had failed to intercept or comprehend, was that Adolf Hitler had issued orders weeks before that transformed Aachen from a mere geographic objective into something far more consequential. The Führer, reacting to the collapse in France and the flood of refugees eastward, had designated Aachen as a fortress city, a Festung that must be held at all costs. No withdrawal would be permitted, no surrender would be negotiated. The city would become a symbol of German resistance, a place where the Nazi regime would make its stand against the advancing enemy. These orders had already begun to reshape the German command structure around Aachen, drawing resources and reinforcements that might have been deployed elsewhere, creating the skeleton of a garrison that would fight not for military logic, but for ideological imperative. The fatal disconnect between American assumptions of rapid advance and German orders for absolute defense had begun to form, and neither side fully grasped the cost this misalignment would exact. In the second week of September, reconnaissance patrols from American cavalry and armored units began probing outward from the advancing front, searching for German positions and testing the enemy's strength. These were men trained to move swiftly and report what they found rather than to fight pitched battles. But in the rolling terrain approaching Aachen, contact became increasingly frequent and increasingly hostile. German units had not melted away, as some American commanders had expected. Instead, they had begun establishing defensive positions in villages and along natural barriers, using the landscape to slow the American advance. Small firefights erupted. German machine guns would suddenly open fire from a wood line or a fortified farmhouse. American soldiers would take cover and call for support, and the Germans would withdraw or be overrun. These encounters were brief, usually lasting only minutes, but they indicated something troubling. The Germans were not fleeing blindly eastward. They were resisting in an organized fashion, fighting delaying actions with discipline and coordination. Captain James Hollingsworth, commanding a cavalry reconnaissance troop from the 86th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, was among the first Americans to encounter German defensive preparations around Aachen. Moving through the villages on the city's western approaches, his men began discovering evidence that German forces had begun fortifying positions. Anti-tank guns emplaced in cellars, machine gun nests constructed in rubble, mines laid across roads and ditches. The evidence was fragmentary and scattered, not yet consolidated into a unified defensive line, but it suggested that someone in the German command structure had ordered preparations for a stand. When Hollingsworth's patrols pushed closer to Aachen itself, they began taking increasingly accurate fire from German defenders, who appeared to have studied the terrain and prepared killing zones along the likely approaches. Other American reconnaissance units reported similar findings, and a picture began to emerge of a German garrison that, contrary to expectations, intended to defend the city rather than abandon it. The initial American response to these early contacts was a mixture of curiosity and confidence. Officers and enlisted men alike interpreted the scattered resistance as the dying gasps of a beaten army, the final convulsions of an enemy force that lacked the strength or will to mount serious resistance. After weeks of driving through France against generally collapsing opposition, American soldiers had developed a perhaps understandable but ultimately dangerous confidence in their ability to brush aside any German force that stood in their path. Intelligence officers questioned prisoners captured in these early skirmishes, and the men interrogated spoke of reinforcements arriving, of orders to hold positions, of a German garrison that numbered in the thousands. But these reports were often skeptically received, viewed through the lens of expectation that German forces could not, mount serious urban defense. The American forward momentum had become self-reinforcing, a collective belief that the war in Europe would be decided in a final campaign of maneuver and encirclement before winter set in. By the third week of September, American forces had advanced close enough to Aachen that reconnaissance patrols could see the city's outskirts clearly, mapping German positions and identifying the defensive terrain. What they reported was beginning to trouble some American commanders who had the experience and imagination to read what they were seeing. The Germans had not constructed a hasty, improvised perimeter. Instead, they had systematically fortified positions, prepared defensive obstacles, and positioned their forces with an intent that suggested they would not easily be dislodged. Intelligence reports, which had been contradictory and often dismissed, began to coalesce around a more troubling picture: that Aachen might actually be defended seriously, that capturing it might require more than a brief assault by mobile forces. Yet even as this intelligence accumulated, the dominant assumption among American commanders remained that once serious pressure was applied, once the Americans demonstrated their overwhelming power and willingness to use it, the German garrison would negotiate surrender or attempt to escape. It would simply be a matter of maintaining the momentum, applying force, and advancing onward. What American commanders also failed to fully appreciate was the psychological distance between the frontline soldiers and the strategic planners. Infantrymen advancing toward Aachen did not think in terms of campaigns or grand strategy. They understood their immediate reality: the sound of German machine gun fire, the whistle of incoming shells, the smell of smoke and burned powder, the loss of comrades who had become friends. For them, the Germans defending Aachen were not a broken army playing out its final act. They were a real and present danger, visible and lethal. The soldiers advancing through the villages around Aachen were beginning to sense, perhaps without fully articulating it, that the nature of their mission was changing. The war had entered a new phase, one where the enemy would fight not to win, but to make the Americans bleed for every inch of ground. This recognition spread through the enlisted ranks faster than it percolated through the higher command, creating a gap between tactical reality and strategic assumption that would only widen in the coming weeks. German commanders in and around Aachen were themselves in a state of confusion and conflicting orders. Hitler's fortress designation had come through proper channels, but local commanders were also receiving messages to prepare for a counteroffensive, to hold Aachen as a base for operations designed to drive the Americans back, or at least blunt their advance. These contradictory directives, hold the city as a fortress, but also prepare to attack, created a fractured approach to defense that left Colonel Gerhard Wilk and other German officers uncertain about their true strategic mission. Were they defending a position they would eventually be relieved from, or were they preparing for a last stand? Were reinforcements coming, or were they on their own? These questions remained unanswered, and the confusion filtered down to the troops who would bear the ultimate burden of whatever was decided. Yet despite the uncertainty, orders to prepare Aachen for defense were being executed, resources were flowing into the city, and the German garrison was growing as reinforcements and conscripted soldiers began arriving from other sectors. The physical contact between American reconnaissance forces and German defenders in the villages around Aachen was beginning to reveal the true state of affairs, even if American command staffs were slow to accept what the evidence was telling them. German soldiers captured in these early skirmishes spoke of orders to hold, of expectations of reinforcement, of a garrison that would resist. German defensive positions were becoming more coherent as the Germans adjusted to the American presence and continued their preparations. The ineffective American probes and the brief, inconclusive firefights were actually providing valuable intelligence to both sides. The Americans were learning what serious German resistance would look like, and the Germans were learning how the Americans would likely approach and attack the city. Neither side could claim a decisive tactical advantage from these early contacts, but the pattern they revealed suggested that the easy phase of the American advance was ending and something far more difficult and costly was beginning. By the last week of September, as the weather turned cooler and the autumn darkness began to arrive earlier each evening, American forces had consolidated their positions around Aachen's perimeter without achieving any decisive breakthrough. The city's defenders had not crumbled under the weight of reconnaissance probes and limited infantry assaults. Instead, they had grown stronger, more confident, more organized in their resistance. American commanders found themselves facing a decision that many of them had not anticipated just weeks earlier, whether to attempt a rapid assault on the city or to prepare for a more deliberate and sustained operation. The assumption that German forces would collapse at any serious show of force had been tested and found wanting. The Wehrmacht, or at least this garrison of Wehrmacht, was demonstrating a capacity and willingness to resist that forced a reckoning with expectations that had seemed so assured just days before. What neither American soldiers nor German defenders could have fully grasped in these early days of contact was that they were approaching a moment of transition, a threshold between two different wars. Behind them lay weeks of mobile warfare, rapid advances, the collapse of German field armies, and the liberation of occupied territory. Ahead of them lay urban combat, siege operations, civilian suffering on an extraordinary scale, and a battle that would consume thousands of lives before it was resolved. The brief, inconclusive contacts around Aachen's perimeter in September represented the last moments of the old war before the new one began. American commanders would soon come to understand that the Wehrmacht, whatever its broader strategic collapse, could still fight with skill and determination when ideology and orders compelled them to hold ground. The first German city to fall to the Allies would not fall easily, and the cost of its capture would reshape American understanding of what the final defeat of Nazi Germany would demand. In the opening days of October 1944, the American First Army stood at a peculiar crossroads. The momentum that had carried them from Normandy across France and through the suburbs of Aachen had begun to slow, not from enemy counterattack, but from the stubborn reality of urban geography and entrenched German resistance. General Omar Bradley and his commanders faced a choice that would determine the nature of the coming weeks: attempt to bypass Aachen entirely and race deeper into German territory, or commit to capturing this ancient city that now symbolized the threshold of the Reich itself. The American High Command ultimately decided that leaving a functional German garrison in their rear, capable of threatening supply lines and launching harassment attacks, posed too great a strategic risk. More than this, however, Aachen held symbolic weight that no commander could ignore. It was German soil, and German cities did not simply surrender to invading armies. By the 6th of October, American forces had achieved a rough encirclement of Aachen's outer perimeter, though the siege lines remained incomplete and German forces retained limited corridors of movement and supply. American artillery had begun sporadic bombardment, and reconnaissance patrols probed German defenses with increasing intensity. Yet for all this military positioning, no one had actually demanded that the Germans surrender. That changed decisively on the 9th of October, when American commanders issued a formal ultimatum to the German garrison. The document, carried forward under a flag of truce by American officers, presented Colonel Gerhard Wilk with a stark proposition. The Americans demanded the immediate evacuation of all remaining civilians from Aachen, a process they estimated would require approximately 24 hours, and the surrender of the German garrison within a specified time frame. The ultimatum was not couched in threats or wild promises, but rather in the language of military expediency and humanitarian concern. American commanders recognized that urban combat in Aachen would inflict catastrophic casualties on civilians still sheltering in the city's cellars and basements. They understood from bitter experience in other French cities that surrender avoided the kind of destruction that made reconstruction impossible and bred generations of resentment. The ultimatum offered the Germans a path toward preserving both their lives and the physical fabric of their city, a rational military calculation delivered with the weight of American military might behind it. The proposal carried an implicit message. The Americans possessed overwhelming force and would use it without hesitation if Aachen did not surrender, but they were offering mercy for those willing to lay down arms and allow civilians to evacuate. Colonel Wilk received this ultimatum in the command post, where he had established German headquarters for the defense of Aachen. Wilk was no fanatic in the traditional Nazi mold. He was a professional Wehrmacht officer who understood military mathematics and recognized that his garrison faced impossible odds. Nevertheless, he also understood something equally important. He held orders directly from Berlin, orders that came from Hitler himself, declaring Aachen a fortress city that must be held at all costs. These orders did not permit negotiation, evacuation, or tactical withdrawal. They mandated resistance to the last soldier, transformation of the city into an urban redoubt that would bleed the Allies and buy time for German strategic recovery. Hitler's fortress designation carried the force of law within the German military structure. To disobey meant courts-martial, execution, or worse. Moreover, Wilk's garrison included not merely Wehrmacht regulars, but also fanatical Nazi Party officials, SS elements, and Hitler Youth detachments, whose primary loyalty was to Nazi ideology rather than military hierarchy. These men watched Wilk's every decision, reported infractions up their own command chains, and bore orders to ensure that the garrison did not waver in its commitment to total defense. Wilk's personal views on the ultimatum mattered less than his understanding that rejecting it was the only option available to him within the constraints of Nazi military law and the ideological apparatus that enforced it. Wilk's response came swiftly and carried the absolute finality that only a military officer bound by impossible orders could deliver. He rejected the American ultimatum categorically and unconditionally. The German garrison, he declared, would defend Aachen to its final soldier rather than surrender or permit evacuation of civilians that might free American soldiers for combat elsewhere. Wilk's refusal was not merely military defiance. It was a statement of Nazi principle, a reaffirmation that German cities would not fall to foreign invasion without exacting maximum cost and pain. The formal rejection came clothed in the language of military honor and national defense, framing surrender as an impossibility that violated the fundamental obligations of a German officer. Behind this formal language, however, ran deeper currents of ideology, fear, and coercion. Officers who negotiated too eagerly or questioned no retreat orders faced potential execution by their own subordinates or superiors. The Nazi regime had long since established that military officers were not merely military commanders, but also guardians of Nazi political principles, and deviation from those principles constituted a form of treason. Wilk, whether he fully believed in the ideological framework or not, could not step outside it without risking his own life and court-martialing. His refusal of the ultimatum thus became not merely a military decision, but an existential commitment to a course of action that both he and the American commanders understood would end in destruction. The American commanders received Wilk's refusal with a mixture of frustration and grim recognition. They had offered the Germans and the civilian population a way to preserve themselves, and Wilk had rejected it with absolute clarity. This refusal transformed the military situation fundamentally and irrevocably. The American advance was no longer a race to capture a German city. It was now unambiguously a siege. The United States Army would lay siege to Aachen, and that siege would involve all the machinery of modern industrial warfare: artillery, air power, armor, and infantry, committed to reducing the city block by block and building by building. American commanders understood that this transformation meant increased casualties for their own forces and inevitable destruction of the city and the civilian population sheltering within it. They also understood that they no longer bore responsibility for that destruction. Responsibility lay with the German commanders who had rejected all opportunity for evacuation and surrender. American military law and doctrine held that commanders issuing ultimatums and receiving refusals bore no further obligation to minimize civilian casualties beyond what military necessity required. The refusal had shifted the burden of choice entirely onto German shoulders. From that moment forward, any destruction inflicted on Aachen and any civilian deaths would be direct consequences of Wilk's refusal to allow evacuation or surrender. The American response took material form in the days that followed Wilk's refusal. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, issued orders to intensify the isolation of Aachen and prepare for full-scale assault on the city. American artillery units that had been positioned around the city's perimeter were reinforced with additional guns and ammunition stocks, creating a formidable fire plan that could deliver unprecedented volumes of shells onto German positions. American air power assets were reserved for operations against Aachen, with fighter bombers and medium bombers tasked to strike targets within the city whenever weather permitted. Armor units received orders to concentrate around Aachen's perimeter, preparing to provide direct fire support to infantry units that would eventually assault the city. Engineer units began surveying routes through the city and identifying key objectives: the cathedral, the city hall, the main intersections that would need to be captured. American intelligence officers intensified their reconnaissance of Aachen's defenses, questioning prisoners and refugees to develop increasingly detailed pictures of German positions, strengths, and supplies. The American military machine, confronted with Wilk's refusal, began to shift into a configuration designed for systematic urban destruction. Every unit received orders that conveyed a single clear message: Aachen would be captured, and the cost would be whatever was necessary to achieve that objective. From the German perspective, Wilk's refusal crystallized a commitment to defense that would now extend through weeks of relentless combat. The German commander issued orders throughout the garrison, emphasizing that the ultimatum had been rejected and that every soldier must prepare himself for the grinding urban warfare that would follow. German engineers accelerated fortification of buildings, construction of barricades, and preparation of defensive positions throughout Aachen's neighborhoods. Ammunition was redistributed according to new calculations that assumed no resupply and no retreat. Every round had to be treasured and used with precision. German medical personnel began organizing field hospitals in the basements of buildings that seemed likely to withstand bombardment, knowing that wounded men would accumulate faster than any evacuation could handle. German commanders accepted the reality that they were now presiding over what amounted to a death sentence for many of their men, yet they enforced discipline and ensured that retreat or surrender remained impossible through all the psychological and physical mechanisms of Nazi military coercion. The refusal of the ultimatum had transformed Aachen from a position to be held into a tomb in which men would live and die according to orders they could not disobey. The civilian population trapped within Aachen experienced Wilkes' refusal as a catastrophe beyond comprehension. For those German civilians still sheltering in the city, the rejection of the American ultimatum meant that bombing, shelling, and urban combat would descend on their homes with the force of natural disaster. They had hoped, with increasing desperation, that American pressure would force German evacuation or surrender, that the city would fall relatively intact and their ordeal would end. Instead, the refusal meant that every day ahead would bring more noise, more dust, more danger, more suffering. The civilians understood in some visceral way that Colonel Wilk had just condemned them to weeks of terror and that many of them would not survive the ordeal. Families huddled in cellars and basements throughout the city received the news with a kind of bitter resignation. German pride and Nazi ideology had just replaced hope with horror. Mothers held their children closer. Elderly people who had imagined they might yet be evacuated or spared the worst of the fighting now understood they were trapped. The civilian population of Aachen became, in that moment, not merely victims of war, but hostages to German military pride and Nazi no-surrender doctrine. They understood that their suffering had just been guaranteed by a refusal that they had no power to influence. The refusal also sent ripples through the broader German military and political hierarchy. Hitler, informed that Wilk had rejected American terms and committed the garrison to total defense, appears to have received the news with satisfaction. The German dictator had issued orders that Aachen be held as a fortress city precisely because he understood that every day of German resistance in German territory would demonstrate continued German capability and determination to his population, his military, and the wider world. Wilkes' refusal, refusing surrender, and instead committing to defense unto destruction, aligned perfectly with Hitler's ideological requirement that German soil be defended with absolute commitment. German military commanders further up the chain of command received notification of the refusal and the resulting siege with less enthusiasm. They understood increasingly clearly that Germany could not win this war, that holding individual cities at such cost would not alter fundamental strategic realities, and that the destruction being launched on German territory would haunt the nation for generations. Yet they too remained bound by the hierarchy of command and the reality that questioning Hitler's orders meant risking their own lives and careers. The refusal of the ultimatum thus set in motion a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the military situation around Aachen itself. The American commanders, having received their definitive refusal, now faced the necessity of transforming rhetoric into reality. Bombardment would begin in earnest, and artillery fire would rain upon Aachen with a weight that would attempt to break German resistance through sheer destructive force. American soldiers would have to enter the city and fight through every street, every building, every basement and cellar against Germans who had been ordered to resist unto death. This meant American soldiers would suffer casualties, sometimes heavy casualties, in the grinding, attritional urban combat that house-to-house warfare always produced. American commanders accepted this cost as necessary and unavoidable given Wilkes' refusal. They could not bypass Aachen because leaving a German garrison in their rear created unacceptable strategic risks. They could not negotiate further because negotiation had been attempted and rejected. They could not simply bombard the city into submission from a distance because German defenses had been constructed with urban warfare in mind and would require troops on the ground to root out. The refusal of the ultimatum had thus committed both sides to a course of action that neither truly desired, but both felt obligated to pursue by the logic of military law, ideology, and honor. The days that followed Wilkes' refusal witnessed an eerie calm in Aachen, a kind of pause before the full machinery of warfare descended upon the city. American forces completed their encirclement and brought more artillery into position. German forces conducted final preparations for the siege that was now inevitable. Civilians sheltered in cellars and basements, waiting for the bombardment that they knew was coming. The ultimatum had served its legal and psychological purpose. It had been offered, it had been refused, and responsibility for the consequences now lay entirely with the German garrison. International law, in the form of the laws of war that governed such situations, held that an ultimatum refusing bombardment of a civilian population, if rejected by military defenders, removed the attacking force's obligation to minimize civilian casualties. The burden of protection for civilians now fell entirely upon the German garrison, which could have ensured that protection by accepting evacuation and surrender. Instead, Wilkes' refusal meant that civilians would now endure whatever destruction modern warfare could inflict upon them. The ultimatum and its refusal had crystallized the situation into absolute clarity. Aachen would fall, but only through weeks of relentless combat and bombardment that would leave the city fundamentally transformed. In those final days before bombardment and street fighting began, both American and German commanders understood that they had reached a point of no return. The ultimatum and its rejection had eliminated all the middle positions, all the compromises, all the ways to achieve military objectives without maximum destruction and bloodshed. Wilkes had chosen to commit his garrison to total defense, and American commanders had accepted that they would have to wage total war to take the city. The psychological and political logic that had driven Wilkes' refusal, the requirement to demonstrate continued German willingness to fight on German soil, to show that the Wehrmacht would not collapse before foreign invaders, to prove that Nazi ideology would sustain itself through any sacrifice, had overridden any rational military calculation. Colonel Wilkes had not believed that refusing the ultimatum would preserve Aachen or save the German garrison or achieve any meaningful military outcome. He had refused because refusing was the only option that remained within the constraints of Nazi military law, ideology, and the apparatus of coercion that enforced both. American commanders recognized this reality, but it did not change the task before them. Aachen would now endure weeks of bombardment and urban warfare before it fell. Thousands of lives would be lost, German soldiers, American soldiers, and civilians trapped in the middle. The ultimatum and its refusal had set in motion forces that neither side could now control or moderate, forces that would reshape Aachen from an ancient hands. The ultimatum has been rejected. Colonel Wilkes' refusal to surrender has sealed Aachen's fate, and American commanders now face a choice that will echo across the coming weeks. The city must fall, and there is no longer any pretense of a negotiated solution. What follows is not strategy in any classical sense. It is the application of overwhelming force against a target that cannot escape, cannot negotiate, and cannot hope to resist the full weight of American military machinery. The artillery begins to move into position in the second week of October, gun crews working methodically to register firing coordinates on the city that sprawls before them. Forward observers move closer, identifying targets through binoculars and field glasses, calling back coordinates to batteries positioned miles away. The first rounds are fired not in anger but in calculation, a systematic destruction that will consume resources and time in equal measure. What is about to unfold is not a battle in any traditional sense. It is an execution conducted at a distance, where the condemned city has no means of striking back, where civilian and soldier alike will suffer under the same rain of explosives. The bombardment itself begins on the 15th of October, and it does not stop. Wave after wave of shells arc through the sky above Aachen, their trajectory taking them across the German fortifications, the civilian quarters, the historical districts, the rubble-strewn streets. American artillery parks spread across the countryside surrounding the city, hundreds of guns coordinating their fire through a network of observers and fire control centers. Some guns fire high explosive rounds designed to demolish structures and kill at distance. Others use airburst ammunition that explodes above the target, raining shrapnel downward with devastating effect. Still others fire illumination rounds that turn night into day, allowing observers to track the progress of destruction and adjust fires for maximum effect. The sound becomes almost mechanical in its persistence, the crack of each gun, the whistle of shells in flight, the distant thunder of impact followed by the sharp crack of detonation. Dust rises from the city in vast plumes, towering hundreds of feet into the air, until Aachen becomes almost hidden behind a curtain of smoke and debris. The bombardment continues through day and night, through clear weather and into rain, stopping only to allow ammunition to be brought forward and gun crews to rotate shifts. The precision of the bombardment contrasts sharply with its indiscriminate effect. American forward observers position themselves as close to German lines as possible, using binoculars, field telephones, and radio sets to direct fire onto specific targets. A German strongpoint in a particular building receives concentrated fire that turns the structure into a shattered ruin. A barricade at a street intersection is systematically destroyed. Supply lines and ammunition storage areas identified through prisoner interrogation become priority targets. In theory, each shell serves a military purpose, directed at a legitimate objective. In practice, the distinction between military target and civilian location dissolves almost entirely in the urban landscape. A building used by German defenders one day becomes a shelter for frightened civilians the next. A street fortified with German obstacles and trenches is also the street where families once walked to work or to shops. The artillery fires at the city as a geometric problem to be solved, unaware of or indifferent to the human geography beneath the bombardment. The casualties accumulate with horrible swiftness. Civilians still sheltered in cellars and basements feel the detonations as physical shocks transmitted through earth and stone. The percussion of nearby explosions can rupture eardrums and organs at a distance. The collapse of buildings above shelter areas buries those below under tons of brick, stone, and timber. Fires start across the city as gas lines rupture and fragments ignite combustible materials. Water mains burst, making it impossible to fight fires or provide water to those sheltering below. Sanitation systems fail, and disease begins to spread among the tightly packed civilian populations hiding in underground spaces. Food runs out as supplies were never calculated for a bombardment lasting days without pause. Wounded accumulate in cellars and basements where medical care is non-existent, where infection and shock claim lives that might have been saved in any functioning hospital. The psychological effect becomes almost as devastating as the physical destruction. The constant noise, the unpredictable arrival of death from above, the knowledge that escape is impossible and rescue may never come. The historical center of Aachen becomes the focus of particular destruction. The cathedral, where German emperors have been crowned since the days of Charlemagne, sustains damage as shells fall across the city without regard to historical or religious significance. City Hall, the seat of municipal government for centuries, is bombarded and set alight. The medieval city walls, still partially standing and of minimal military value, are reduced to rubble. The neighborhoods where citizens of Aachen lived for generations are systematically obliterated. Church spires that served as landmarks for centuries are brought down by artillery fire. Market squares where community life gathered for hundreds of years become craters and smoking ruins. The destruction is not incidental to military operations but rather comprehensive and thorough. A transformation of the urban landscape into something unrecognizable. What was once a coherent city becomes a debris field, a geography of rubble and ash where orientation becomes nearly impossible. German defenders, for their part, cannot respond effectively to the bombardment. Their anti-aircraft guns, few in number, fire at American aircraft that operate with virtual impunity above the city. Their field artillery, deployed in defensive positions, cannot concentrate fire on American gun positions because doing so would expose their locations to observation and counter-battery fire. The Germans are reduced to absorbing the bombardment, holding their positions as best they can, waiting for the moment when American infantry will emerge from the smoke and rubble to assault through the city. Some German units are partially buried by the bombardment, suffering casualties among their own troops even as they prepare to resist. Others are forced to relocate positions as their defensive lines are obliterated. The bombardment serves to disorganize German defenders, destroy their infrastructure, and force them into exhaustion and stress even before the ground assault begins. Yet it also hardens their resolve in a peculiar way. Having survived the bombardment, they feel compelled to continue resisting rather than surrender to an enemy that has demonstrated such overwhelming power. The American Air Force contributes its own devastating portion to the destruction of Aachen. Medium bombers strike the city in concentrated waves, unloading hundreds of tons of high-explosive ordnance from altitudes where German anti-aircraft fire cannot reliably reach them. Fighter bombers conduct low-level attacks on identified German positions, strafing with machine gun fire and dropping bombs with precision that is both remarkable and terrible. The scale of air operations is almost incomprehensible. Dozens of sorties per day, each delivering multiple tons of explosives, continuing for days without significant pause. The smoke from bombardment sometimes makes targeting difficult, but American pilots press on regardless, dropping ordnance through the smoke clouds and trusting that the city below will absorb whatever falls. Anti-aircraft defenses are suppressed through attacks on gun positions and through the simple quantity of aircraft overwhelming the German air defense network. At times, American aircraft have to hold formation and circle above Aachen, waiting their turn to attack because there are so many aircraft in the queue to strike at the city. The civilian population endures conditions that test human capacity for survival. Those sheltering in cellars find themselves trapped in darkness, with only candles or matches for light, conserving them because replacements cannot be obtained. The air becomes foul from human waste, unwashed bodies, and the dust penetrating from bombardment above. Disease spreads rapidly in the crowded underground spaces. Dysentery, pneumonia, and infections ravaging those already weakened by fear and malnutrition. Children cry from hunger and thirst, and parents have almost nothing to offer them. The wounded among the sheltering population receive no medical attention beyond what untrained civilians can provide with improvised bandages. Dead bodies sometimes remain in the cellars for days because removing them to bury them is impossible while bombardment continues. Some civilians attempt to move between shelters searching for food or water, and many are killed by artillery fire while doing so. The psychological breakdown is as severe as the physical deterioration. Many sheltering civilians develop complete detachment from reality, sitting silently in the darkness, waiting for death or rescue that seems equally unlikely. The bombardment lasts through the third week of October, consuming ammunition at rates that strain even American logistics systems. Trucks arrive day and night at ammunition supply points, delivering shells that are immediately distributed to gun crews and forward positions. The firing becomes almost rhythmic after a while, so constant and predictable that those close to it sometimes stop registering the noise and danger consciously. Forward observers become almost numb to the destruction they are causing, calling in coordinates with clinical detachment, discussing fire missions with the matter-of-factness of routine administrative work. American soldiers waiting for the inevitable ground assault contemplate the bombardment with mixed emotions: gratitude that the enemy is being softened before they must assault, but also awareness that the destruction is creating a nightmare world of rubble and obstacles that will make their own advance difficult and dangerous. The bombardment achieves its military purposes to a significant degree. German defensive positions are damaged or destroyed. Supply lines are disrupted. Fortifications are obliterated. Communication lines are severed. German troops are exhausted and traumatized. Reserves are depleted as casualties mount. The infrastructure that might have supported organized resistance is degraded. Yet the bombardment also creates an urban wasteland that will make American infantry assault far more difficult than assaulting intact buildings. The rubble provides excellent defensive positions for determined defenders. The destruction obscures the city's geography, making navigation difficult for attackers. The dust and smoke make observation problematic. The American artillery and air force have prepared Aachen for American infantry to assault, but in doing so, they have also prepared defensive positions that German troops can exploit. The bombardment is simultaneously necessary for American success and destructive of the conditions necessary for rapid American success. When the bombardment finally slows and then ceases, the scale of destruction becomes partially visible through the clearing smoke and dust. Entire city blocks have been reduced to rubble so thoroughly that the street layout can barely be discerned. The few buildings still partially standing are mostly burned-out shells. Fires burn throughout the city, consuming whatever combustible material remained after the bombardment. The smell of explosives, burning buildings, and death pervades the air. Survivors begin emerging from shelters, many moving in a daze, looking for family members or some familiar landmark to orient themselves. The German garrison, battered but still intact, prepares defensive positions in the rubble and prepares to receive the American infantry assault that must inevitably follow. The city that once stood as a symbol of German imperial greatness now stands as a monument to the destructive power of industrial warfare. Aachen has been pounded, but not broken. The bombardment has prepared the ground, but victory is not yet assured. American infantry must now advance through this world of rubble, against defenders who are battered but determined, through a city that has been transformed from an urban center into a fortress of debris and ash. By the final days of October 1944, Aachen's outer defenses had begun to crumble under the relentless weight of American firepower. The bombardment that had pounded the city for days had reduced much of its eastern and southern approaches to fields of rubble and ash. Yet it had also created something far more dangerous than intact fortifications. A maze of broken buildings, collapsed walls, and hidden firing positions that transformed every street corner into a potential ambush. American commanders, having anticipated a rapid breakthrough, now confronted a different kind of resistance, one born not from organized defensive lines, but from the chaos of urban destruction itself. The first American infantrymen to move into Aachen's outer streets in late October discovered that the city's collapse had not weakened the German defenders, but rather strengthened their resolve, turning the ruins into a fortress of a different character. What should have been a quick advance into German territory became instead a grinding, block-by-block crawl through a landscape where every building concealed potential death, and where the rubble itself seemed to fight alongside the defenders. The soldiers of the First Army's infantry divisions moving into Aachen's edges were not prepared for this kind of warfare. They had trained for rapid maneuver, for sweeping movements across open terrain where their superior numbers and firepower could be deployed with devastating effect. Urban combat was something they had studied in theory, yet the reality of it transcended any training scenario. Moving down a ruined street meant exposure to fire from multiple levels above and from hidden positions in adjacent buildings. A German soldier with a rifle could hold up an entire platoon from a rubble pile or a cellar window. Machine gunners positioned in the upper floors of partially destroyed houses could rake advancing Americans with fire that came from angles and heights the soldiers could not easily suppress. The Germans had transformed Aachen's destruction into an advantage, using the rubble not merely as cover, but as a three-dimensional battlefield where they possessed superior knowledge of routes, firing lines, and escape paths. The American advance into the southern suburbs of Aachen began with tentative probes by reconnaissance squads, small groups of soldiers moving carefully through the streets to test German strength and identify strong points. These initial contacts were often sharp and brief. German defenders would open fire from hidden positions. American soldiers would take cover and return fire, and then the Germans would withdraw to secondary positions deeper into the city. These exchanges claimed steady casualties, a trickle of American dead and wounded that seemed almost routine against the scale of the broader operation, yet which added up over hours and days into a mounting human cost. Company commanders began to understand that they would not be racing through Aachen, but rather fighting for it, block by block, street by street, at a pace measured not in kilometers per day, but in meters per hour. The initial assumption that German forces would collapse or flee was replaced by a grimmer recognition that they would have to be killed or forced to surrender, one position at a time. As American infantry companies and platoons moved deeper into the city's edges, the character of the fighting crystallized into a pattern that would repeat throughout the battle. A squad or platoon would advance along a street, moving from one piece of cover to another, keeping buildings between themselves and suspected German positions. German defenders, often just a handful of soldiers in a fortified building or basement, would open fire when the Americans came within effective range. The Americans would take cover and attempt to locate the source of fire while laying down suppressing fire of their own. Machine gunners and riflemen would concentrate their fire on suspected enemy positions, trying to keep German heads down long enough for assault squads to maneuver. These assault squads, sometimes just 4 or 5 soldiers, would work their way toward the German position, often splitting their approach to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Once they closed within grenade-throwing distance, the battle would resolve itself in seconds of chaotic violence, with grenades, pistols, and bayonets doing the work that rifles could not. Survivors would withdraw, and the American unit would consolidate its position before preparing to advance again. The Germans defending Aachen understood that they could not halt the American advance through conventional defensive tactics. The Americans possessed overwhelming advantages in artillery, armor, and numbers. Instead, German defenders employed a strategy of deliberate delay, attempting to inflict maximum casualties while yielding ground in controlled increments. German commanders would establish a series of defensive lines, holding the first for as long as practicable before withdrawing to the second, then repeating the process. This strategy required discipline and leadership, as soldiers had to execute withdrawals under fire without breaking into a rout, and commanders had to resist the temptation to hold positions until their units were surrounded and destroyed. The Germans were generally successful at maintaining this controlled withdrawal, though the cost in casualties and captured soldiers mounted steadily. Hitler's no-retreat orders complicated this strategy, requiring German commanders to employ coercive measures to ensure compliance, shooting deserters and threatening officers who showed insufficient zeal in resisting. Aachen's urban topology became a character in the battle itself. The city's medieval core possessed narrow streets, dense construction, and numerous basements and underground passages that created a three-dimensional battlefield. American soldiers advancing down a street might face fire from second and third floor windows, from rooftops, and from basement windows simultaneously. A building that appeared to be just rubble often contained multiple rooms, interconnected passages, and defensive positions that could only be cleared by entering and searching methodically, a process that was both time-consuming and dangerous. German defenders who anticipated American movement through a particular street could set up ambushes in buildings ahead, knowing the Americans would advance in predictable patterns seeking cover. Once American soldiers committed to moving down a street, they were channeled into killing zones where their superior numbers provided less advantage. The vertical nature of urban combat also meant that American armor provided less protection than in open-field warfare. Tanks moving down narrow streets could be attacked from above, and their guns could not elevate sufficiently to engage targets in upper-floor windows or on rooftops. American commanders began adapting their tactics as the fighting developed, introducing new techniques and methods designed specifically for urban warfare. Tank infantry coordination became more refined, with tanks positioning themselves to provide supporting fire for advancing infantry, while infantrymen protected the tanks from German anti-tank weapons and assault teams. Flamethrowers were brought forward, used to clear German defenders from buildings by making positions untenable through heat and fire, rather than requiring soldiers to enter rooms where German soldiers might be concealed. Combat engineers accompanied infantry squads, using explosives to collapse buildings onto German defenders, to breach walls between buildings, or to clear rubble blocking streets. Artillery was shifted from targeting distant positions to providing close support, with shells directed at specific buildings where German defenders had been spotted. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support became tighter, with spotters directing fire onto German positions while infantry held back until American firepower had suppressed enemy resistance sufficiently to make an advance feasible. The casualty rate among American soldiers increased noticeably as the fighting shifted into Aachen's denser urban areas. Men who had survived weeks of open-field combat found urban warfare more disorienting and more immediately lethal. Soldiers could be killed by snipers firing from buildings they could not see, by grenades thrown from windows they could not reach, by machine gun fire that came from unexpected angles. Medical aid men worked constantly, moving through the streets to reach wounded men, applying tourniquets and bandages while under fire, organizing evacuation of the most seriously wounded. Field hospitals established in safer areas of the city's periphery, filled with casualties, men missing limbs, men blinded by shrapnel, men who had simply been in the wrong place when a grenade detonated or a machine gun opened fire. The steady accumulation of casualties was demoralizing, a grinding attrition that seemed without end. Officers tried to maintain morale by pointing toward progress made, blocks taken, German defenders killed or captured, yet the cost in American lives seems disproportionate to the gains achieved. German defenders, meanwhile, were running low on ammunition, food, and reinforcements. The American encirclement cut off fresh supplies, and the defenders had to make hard calculations about how long their ammunition reserves would sustain the fighting. Wounded German soldiers filled the same cellars and basements that harbored remaining civilians, creating scenes of desperate crowding and suffering. Some German defenders, particularly among younger conscripts and men who had already survived years of combat, began to question the wisdom of continued resistance. Officers and Nazi Party representatives circulated through defensive positions, attempting to stiffen resolve, threatening execution for cowardice or defeatism. These measures prevented outright collapse, but could not eliminate the fundamental reality that the Germans were losing, that their position was untenable, and that surrender might be the only choice remaining. Yet Hitler's orders left no room for surrender, creating a psychological bind for German commanders and soldiers alike. The tempo of the American advance accelerated slightly in the first days of November, as German resistance began to show signs of disorganization. Some German defenders were withdrawing faster than their commanders intended, moving back to new positions without order and creating gaps in the defensive line. American soldiers exploited these gaps, moving through streets that German defenders had abandoned, establishing new foothold closer to the city's center. Yet breakthrough moments continued to be contested, with German defenders launching counterattacks, attempting to drive Americans back, or with rearguard units fighting to the death to buy time for other defenders to establish new positions. The fighting remained house to house, room to room, fundamentally personal and intimate. American soldiers clearing buildings encountered German soldiers who were equally intent on killing or surrendering, and exchanges were often resolved at arm's length, with weapons and grenades and blades determining the outcomes. The American advance through Aachen's outskirts and into its main streets represented a new kind of warfare for the soldiers involved, a departure from the mobile, armoured warfare that had characterized the campaign across France. Urban combat required different skills, different equipment, and different mindsets. It was slower than tank warfare, more dangerous in some ways and less in others, and demanded discipline and patience from men who were tired, frightened, and increasingly aware of how many of their comrades were not going to leave Aachen alive. The rubble of the bombardment that was supposed to have weakened German resistance had instead created a perfect defensive terrain, and the Americans found themselves fighting through a city that was physically destroying itself while remaining operationally intact. By early November, American commanders understood that Aachen would not fall through rapid assault, but through steady, grinding advance, a siege conducted through urban streets where every block gained represented casualties, expended, and distances measured in meters. The city that was supposed to be a gateway into Germany had become instead a fortress of rubble where men killed and died for ground measured in yards. By the final week of October, the American advance into Aachen had transformed from a military operation into something far more sinister and intimate. The soldiers pushing through the outer neighborhoods now faced the city's true heart, a medieval core where ancient streets narrowed into killing grounds, where centuries-old stone buildings offered perfect defensive positions, and where German defenders had prepared their deepest lines of resistance. What the Americans encountered was no longer scattered opposition or hastily improvised defenses, but a methodical, disciplined withdrawal conducted by experienced Wehrmacht units who understood the terrain intimately and had prepared it with meticulous care. The Germans had spent weeks fortifying Aachen's center, placing machine guns in upper-story windows, constructing barricades from rubble and furniture, mining major intersections, and ensuring that no single square meter would be surrendered without exacting the maximum cost in American lives. For the soldiers advancing through this ruined landscape, the realization dawned slowly and sickeningly. Every storefront could hide a sniper. Every collapsed wall could shelter a defensive position. Every pile of brick could conceal a booby trap waiting to tear apart the careless or unlucky. The dense urban core, so different from the open countryside where American armor and firepower had dominated for months, suddenly became an American vulnerability and a German asset. The focus of this urban cauldron crystallized around Aachen's most significant landmarks, the cathedral, city hall, and the network of major intersections radiating from the city's center that represented the literal and symbolic heart of this ancient German city. The cathedral, with its distinctive architecture and towering position, became a focal point for both sides. The Germans used its position to observe American movements across wide stretches of street, while the Americans recognized that controlling the cathedral would psychologically demonstrate their command of the city itself. City Hall, likewise, represented both administrative significance and military value. It stood at the intersection of critical streets, offered extensive interior space that could be fortified and defended at multiple levels, and its loss would signal to the dwindling German garrison that further organized resistance had become impossible. These landmarks were not merely symbolic, they were functional strongpoints in a carefully constructed defensive network. German commanders had positioned their best remaining troops around these locations, reinforced them with ammunition and supplies, and issued orders to hold these positions to the bitter end. American commanders, understanding the psychological impact of these locations, prioritized their capture and committed the additional resources necessary to overcome the defenders willing to die rather than surrender them. The fighting around these central positions took on a character fundamentally different from the combat occurring in Aachen's outer neighborhoods. Rather than the relatively open exchanges of fire that had characterized the earlier phases of the advance, soldiers now fought at distances measured in meters rather than kilometers, firing through windows at opponents, visible only in brief, deadly glimpses, tossing grenades around corners without seeing their targets, and engaging in sudden, violent hand-to-hand confrontations when defender and attacker found themselves in the same confined space. The Americans developed brutal efficiency in this environment, using tank fire to collapse buildings suspected of harboring defenders, supporting infantry advances with flamethrower teams who could incinerate entire rooms full of German troops, and coordinating artillery strikes so close to the fighting lines that the margin for error became the margin between victory and fratricidal disaster. The Germans, understanding that they could not match American firepower in direct engagement, shifted to tactics of delay and attrition. They would occupy a position, extract maximum casualties on the Americans, then conduct a controlled withdrawal to the next prepared defensive position a few blocks deeper into the city. This withdraw and defend approach prolonged the battle beyond what rapid American tactics would have otherwise achieved, turning what could have been a rushed capture into a methodical siege where the Germans measured success not by territory held, but by days survived and American casualties inflicted. The human experience of this fighting etched itself into the memories and nightmares of the soldiers who participated in ways that combat in open terrain simply could not replicate. American infantrymen developed a particular tension when entering unknown buildings, knowing that German defenders waited somewhere inside, possibly just out of sight around the next corner, possibly waiting until Americans had advanced far enough into the structure that retreat would be costly. Soldiers learned to move in practiced patterns, throwing grenades into rooms before entering, maintaining covering fire positions to suppress German defenders while their comrades advanced, and developing an almost instinctive coordination that came from experience rather than formal training. They learned to read subtle signs that suggested danger, the particular angle of rubble that suggested an observation post, the smell of German tobacco or recently burned gunpowder indicating recent enemy presence, the absence of visible German defenders, which often meant they were hidden rather than absent. German soldiers, meanwhile, adapted their tactics to the specific advantage offered by dense urban terrain, positioning themselves not in obvious strong points, but in locations that provided unexpected angles of fire, setting up interlocking fields of fire from multiple buildings so that advancing Americans would come under fire from multiple directions simultaneously, and using the complexity of ruined buildings to create defenders' advantages that partially negated the American superiority in firepower. This tactical back and forth, repeated hundreds of times across Aachen's center over the course of days, turned the city into a three-dimensional chess match conducted with bullets and explosives. The cathedral itself became the subject of particularly intense fighting as American units pushed toward the city's geographic and symbolic center. German defenders recognized the cathedral's importance and positioned troops both in and around the structure, using its stone walls as protection while maintaining fire on American approaches from multiple levels and angles. The Americans, aware that destroying this medieval structure would carry enormous symbolic weight, initially attempted to minimize damage while clearing German defenders from the surrounding area, but the intensity of German fire and the determination of the defenders forced increasingly direct methods of combat support. Tank guns directed fire at upper-story windows where German gunners had positioned themselves, collapsing portions of the outer walls and creating breaches through which German defenders might be cleared. Flamethrower teams, advancing under infantry protection, took positions where they could incinerate the interior spaces German defenders occupied, forcing German soldiers to choose between being burned alive in position or emerging to surrender or flee deeper into the building. The fighting around the cathedral became so intense and so chaotic that control of the structure shifted multiple times over the course of single days, as Germans conducting tactical withdrawals abandoned one floor, reoccupied it when Americans advanced carelessly, then withdrew again when American firepower was brought to bear. By the time American forces finally secured the cathedral, controlling all accessible floors and surrounding positions, the structure bore visible scars of the battle, bullet holes pocking the stone, sections of wall collapsed or burned, windows blown out, and the interior transformed into a chaos of rubble and debris. Similar patterns of intense, attritional combat repeated themselves around City Hall and the network of intersections that formed the nervous system of Aachen's center. American commanders, growing increasingly frustrated by the slow pace of advance and the steady accumulation of casualties began concentrating larger amounts of firepower on each objective, essentially trading ammunition and potential collateral damage for reduced infantry casualties and faster territorial gains. This calculated decision to accept higher civilian casualties in exchange for lower soldier casualties represented a grim mathematics, a hierarchy of loss that prioritized American lives in a calculus that the watching civilian population could not ignore. German defenders, recognizing that they faced an enemy willing to launch overwhelming firepower, adapted by becoming increasingly mobile within their defensive positions, occupying a location long enough to inflict casualties and extract tactical value, then vacating before American artillery or air support could be concentrated on that location. These German tactics of strategic withdrawal were not retreat in the traditional sense. They represented a conscious decision to preserve force while accepting the loss of geography, a trade-off that German commanders calculated might extend the battle long enough that something, somewhere, might change to alter the strategic situation. Of course, nothing did change, and the strategic situation only deteriorated for the Germans as their supplies dwindled, their reinforcements failed to materialize, and the encircling American force continued to tighten around Aachen like an inexorable vice. The psychological dimension of this fighting centered on American soldiers' growing awareness that the Germans would not simply collapse or surrender, despite the overwhelming disparity in forces and resources. Earlier in the war, and earlier in the Aachen campaign, American soldiers had occasionally encountered German units that surrendered after minimal resistance, understanding the futility of continued fighting and preferring captivity to death. The Germans defending Aachen's center showed no such pragmatism, and whether motivated by fanatic Nazi ideology, by the presence of SS officers willing to execute deserters, by genuine patriotic conviction, or by the lethal logic that surrendering to urban combat often meant death anyway, they fought with a determination that seemed almost pathological to observers. American soldiers, weary and bloodied, found themselves fighting not against a weakening enemy, but against defenders who seemed to strengthen in their resolve as their situation deteriorated. Grenades were exchanged at increasingly close range, with soldiers sometimes able to throw the German grenade back before it detonated, other times finding that reaction time simply did not exist. German machine gunners, positioned in prepared defensive locations, could suppress entire streets with the concentrated fire from their weapons, pinning down American squads and preventing any attempt at movement or repositioning. American soldiers responded with aggression and firepower, using their superior numbers and equipment to overwhelm the German defenders through a combination of suppressing fire, flanking movements, and concentrated assault once German defenders became pinned by American fire. The role of armor in this urban fighting represented a significant departure from the tank tactics that had dominated the campaign through France. In open terrain, tanks had operated largely as mobile fire support platforms, using their superior speed and firepower to execute flanking maneuvers and breakthrough operations that infantry could not achieve alone. In Aachen's confined streets and urban core, tanks became instruments of building demolition and direct fire support, advancing slowly and methodically behind infantrymen, using their guns and machine guns to suppress German defenders in upper-story positions, and at times simply shelling buildings suspected of harboring German troops. German anti-tank teams, knowing that they faced situations where the close-quarter urban environment might neutralize some of the tank's defensive advantages, attempted to ambush advancing armor with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and mines. But the presence of supporting infantry and the careful reconnaissance American units conducted before advancing significantly reduced the effectiveness of these German efforts. Some tanks, inevitably, were lost to German anti-tank fire or mines, their crews killed or wounded by weapons they never saw coming, but the psychological impact of American armor advancing through German defensive positions often exceeded the physical damage the tanks inflicted, as German defenders recognized that this level of American commitment made further resistance increasingly irrational. By the second week of this intense fighting in Aachen's center, the cumulative effect of days of continuous combat began manifesting in both sides' behavior. American soldiers showed visible signs of exhaustion, their movements becoming slower and less precise, their reaction times degrading, their capacity for sustained concentration declining under the weight of accumulated fear and stress. Soldiers who had been rotating through the fighting for 5 or 6 days without proper rest began making mistakes that cost them their lives, advancing without adequate supporting fire, failing to maintain proper security around buildings, exposing themselves to sniper fire through carelessness born of fatigue. Medics became overwhelmed, treating an endless stream of wounded soldiers while attempting to function on fragments of sleep snatched between emergencies. German defenders, despite their numerical disadvantage and dwindling resources, showed no signs of weakening resolve, though their tactical options narrowed with each passing day. The German garrison was consuming food and ammunition at prodigious rates without any possibility of resupply, and American intelligence reports confirmed that German commanders were consuming everything edible that could be found, including reserves intended for the civilian population. Officers made clear to their men that surrender was not an option, that the Reich expected them to hold Aachen to the final man, and that any discussion of capitulation would result in execution by their own comrades. The fighting around specific intersections demonstrated the grinding, utterly exhausting nature of this urban warfare. An intersection that might be captured on one day could only be held by maintaining constant vigilance and defensive preparations, as German defenders occupying buildings on higher ground or at unexpected angles could bring overwhelming fire to bear on American troops attempting to hold the intersection itself. American units learned through bitter experience that controlling a street required controlling all the buildings overlooking that street, a calculus that multiplied the effort required to capture and hold each block exponentially. Soldiers entering buildings never knew how many defenders waited inside, never knew whether a room was occupied by German soldiers prepared to fight to the death, or whether the building had been abandoned and therefore was booby-trapped with mines and explosives awaiting the unwary. Some buildings required house-to-house clearing operations that took hours or days, advancing methodically through each room and each floor, never allowing the defender to concentrate superior force at any single point. Other buildings could be neutralized by simply collapsing their structures through artillery or tank fire, a solution that was efficient in military terms, but carried enormous collateral consequences for any civilians sheltering within. The experience of German defenders in Aachen's center during this period revealed the paradox at the heart of Nazi ideology and German military culture during this final phase of the war. German soldiers here were not fighting for victory, any such hope had dissolved weeks or months earlier, but for something far more abstract and infinitely more expensive, for honor, for duty, for the concept that a German soldier's obligation was to die rather than surrender, for the ideological commitment to the Third Reich that had been inculcated through years of Nazi education and propaganda. Some German soldiers, particularly older Wehrmacht regulars, had seen enough of war to recognize its futility and had accepted their probable deaths as the price of their continued participation in a hopeless cause. Younger defenders, particularly the Hitler Youth elements pressed into service for the defense of Aachen, fought with the particular intensity of the true believer, convinced that their sacrifice meant something, that Aachen would be remembered as a heroic last stand, that their deaths would contribute to some eventual German victory that rational analysis suggested would never occur. SS elements and Nazi Party officials scattered through the German garrison ensured that these various motivations were maintained through a combination of propaganda, threat, and visible examples of what happened to soldiers who attempted to desert or surrender prematurely. As the fighting in Aachen's center entered its second and third week, the Americans essentially achieved a stalemate of sorts. They controlled significant territory and continued to advance, but at a pace so glacially slow that weeks would be required to eliminate remaining German defenders from the city's core. American commanders, recognizing that the rapid advance that had characterized the Normandy breakout was now impossible, reluctantly accepted a grinding siege mentality, where the goal was to preserve American lives while accepting that capturing Aachen would require far more time, resources, and casualties than the optimistic planning of September had suggested. The city's dense medieval structure, its extensive fortifications, and the German determination to hold it to the last moment had transformed what was supposed to be a rapid advance into a prolonged urban nightmare. The cathedral still stood, but scarred by battle, its interior transformed into a bunker. City Hall remained contested, with control shifting between American advances and German counterattacks that arrived beneath the thunder of artillery and the crack of rifle fire. Another battle unfolds in absolute darkness. While American soldiers advance through Aachen's shattered streets, thousands of civilians crouch in cellars and basement shelters, their world compressed into suffocating stone chambers where the concussion of bombardment shakes dust from ancient walls and makes breathing itself an act of conscious effort. These underground refuges, some natural, others hastily dug or repurposed from centuries-old catacombs, become tombs of the living, where families huddle together in temperatures that swing from freezing to stifling, in air so thick with moisture and human breath that each lungful feels solid. Children cry from hunger and fear, their mothers struggling to keep them quiet, lest noise attract German soldiers or invite American fire through ventilation shafts that penetrate to the surface. The elderly sit in numbed silence, staring at nothing, their minds retreating from a reality too catastrophic to process. Some shelters hold 50 people, others 300, packed so tightly that movement is nearly impossible, and the sanitation becomes a nightmare of overflowing buckets and spreading disease. Time loses all meaning in this subterranean imprisonment. Days blur into each other, marked only by the rhythm of bombardment above and the gradual weakening of bodies sustained on bread crusts and rainwater when supplies can be obtained at all. The bombardment itself becomes the constant background to existence in these shelters, a percussion of violence so relentless and pervasive that survivors later struggle to explain how they did not simply go mad. American artillery, tasked with destroying German fortifications and supporting the infantry advance, makes no meaningful distinction between military targets and civilian areas. Such precision is impossible in urban warfare, especially when German defenders deliberately position themselves in residential neighborhoods to use civilian populations as shields. The shells arrive in waves, some whistling with terrible clarity before impact, others arriving with no warning at all, only the sudden violent shock of detonation that seems to lift entire city blocks and shake them like toys. Walls crack in patterns that advance from bombardment to bombardment, developing fissures and gaps that allow cold air and ash to pour in, mixing with the dust of pulverized concrete and brick. Shelters themselves become unsafe, their roofs and support structures damaged by nearby hits, creating the terrifying possibility that the very refuge meant to save lives might become a grave. In several instances, direct hits or near misses on shelter entrances trap entire groups underground, forcing American soldiers later to dig through rubble by hand to extract the living and the dead. The psychological effect is perhaps as damaging as the physical danger. The complete loss of control, the inability to protect children from noise and chaos, the grinding uncertainty about whether the next explosion will be the last thing anyone in that shelter ever hears. Disease spreads through the shelters with the same inevitability as the rubble spreads through the streets above. Dysentery becomes endemic, transmitted through contaminated water and the impossible sanitation conditions, weakening bodies already depleted by inadequate food supplies. Children suffer first and most severely, their small bodies unable to maintain body temperature in damp stone chambers, or to resist infection spreading through the compressed human mass. Typhus lice thrive in the unwashed clothing and close quarters, creating itching sores that become infected and cause systemic illness among the most vulnerable. Respiratory infections spread like invisible fire through the stale air, and the wounded and elderly, already compromised by age and stress, succumb to pneumonia and related conditions. There are no medicines, no doctors in most shelters. What medical care exists comes from elderly physicians or nurses sheltering with the civilians, working with nothing but bandages salvaged from homes and folk remedies passed down through generations. Infections in wounds turn gangrenous without antibiotics, and some individuals face the grim choice of allowing limbs to die or attempting amputation with a kitchen knife and whatever alcohol can be found. Pregnant women give birth in these conditions, some losing babies to infection or premature delivery brought on by malnutrition and stress. The dead are placed in separate chambers when possible, wrapped in whatever cloth can be spared, their bodies stored in the cold to prevent decomposition, though the distinction between living chambers and death chambers becomes increasingly meaningless as time passes. Starvation moves through Aachen's shelter system with methodical cruelty, consuming bodies week by week in the slow tragedy that bombardment obscures from outside attention. The evacuation ordered by German authorities before the battle removed most civilians from the city, but roughly 100,000 were unable or unwilling to leave their homes, and many of these gravitated toward what they believed were the safest locations. As the siege tightens and supply lines collapse entirely, the food situation becomes catastrophic. Bread rations dwindle to a few hundred grams per person per day, and even that becomes scarce, as German military supplies take absolute priority. Water becomes available only when someone risks going to the surface to find an untapped well or collect rainwater, and each such journey invites sniper fire or artillery strikes. Some civilians eat wallpaper paste, grass, even leather goods, trying to fill the void in their bellies with anything that can technically be ingested. The very young and very old waste away visibly, their eyes growing larger in shrinking faces, their movements becoming slow and dreamlike as malnutrition affects the brain. Mothers, unable to produce milk without adequate nutrition themselves, watch their infants weaken and slip away, a private catastrophe unfolding in the darkness, while the greater catastrophe of urban warfare rages above. The emotional damage from this kind of hunger is as profound as the physical deterioration, the loss of dignity, the reduction of human existence to the bare question of caloric survival, the guilt of parents who cannot feed their children, The despair of grandparents who have lived 70 years to die starving in a bunker while bombs fall outside. When American soldiers first encounter civilians emerging from shelters, the encounter is often chaotic and fraught with mutual terror and incomprehension. These people have not seen daylight in weeks, emerging into rubble-strewn streets that bear no resemblance to the city they entered shelters to escape. Their eyes water and squeeze nearly shut against sunlight that feels painful after so long in darkness. Many are weak to the point of barely being able to walk, requiring support or carrying by soldiers who themselves are exhausted and frightened, their instincts screaming that any movement or concentration of people makes attractive targets. Communication is difficult. Some civilians speak no English, and many American soldiers speak no German, leaving both groups struggling to understand intentions through a haze of fear and language barriers. Civilians often mistrust that the Americans are truly liberators, having been exposed to Nazi propaganda about the Red Army and American bombing campaigns, and some elderly Germans harbor reflexive suspicion of all Allied soldiers. American soldiers, for their part, are trained to view enemy civilians with some detachment, or worse, to regard any German civilian with latent hostility given the bombardment and casualties their units have sustained. Yet the encounters almost universally shift something fundamental in American soldiers. The sight of starving children, of women with haunted eyes, of elderly men so weak they can barely stand, breaks through whatever hardness combat has built and reveals ordinary human beings suffering because of a war they did not start and cannot control. The evacuation of civilians from Aachen becomes a logistical operation running parallel to the military campaign, requiring coordination between combat units, medical personnel, and personnel from American civil affairs divisions assigned to manage civilian populations in occupied territory. Soldiers establish routes through their own defensive lines to create corridors through which civilians can walk or be carried from the city toward temporary camps set up in surrounding villages. These routes must be carefully timed to avoid active combat operations, which means civilians often wait for hours or days in intermediate shelters before movement becomes possible. The weakest are prioritized, particularly children under 10, elderly above 70, and the severely wounded, though this prioritization creates agonizing moral conflicts when parents must choose whether to keep families together or allow children to move ahead. Some soldiers give up their own rations to feed starving civilians, an action technically against orders but enforced irregularly because commanders understand the humanity involved. Medical personnel, stretched thin by the need to treat combat casualties, make space and use precious medical supplies to treat the most severe civilian cases, performing emergency surgery on infected wounds, administering antibiotics to those with life-threatening infections, providing intravenous fluids to those too weak to take food orally. The evacuation itself becomes dangerous, as German defenders sometimes fire on what they perceive as fleeing civilians aiding the American advance, and American artillery occasionally strikes evacuation columns when communication breaks down or coordination fails. Each successful evacuation is a small victory against the machinery of destruction surrounding the city, yet the slow pace of removal, sometimes only a few hundred civilians per day, leaves thousands still underground as the battle continues. The soldiers themselves become witnesses to suffering on a scale that most have never experienced, and the experience fundamentally alters how they understand warfare and its costs. When a 6-year-old girl emerges from a shelter having eaten almost nothing in 2 weeks, her belly swollen from malnutrition, and her mind perhaps already damaged by weeks of bombardment trauma, something breaks in soldiers who have been taught to view war as a soldier's business with victory and defeat. Medics spend hours treating infections and malnutrition cases in makeshift aid stations, trying to save lives with limited supplies and knowledge. Infantry soldiers, who moments before were engaged in firefights with German defenders, find themselves gently helping an 80-year-old man walk across rubble-strewn streets, carrying his weight and moving at his pace despite the tactical impossibility of the situation. Officers must make decisions about committing combat resources to civilian rescue operations, even though those resources might be needed for the military mission. The psychological weight of this dual obligation, to win a battle and to protect non-combatants caught in the battle, creates stress that manifests in the years after the war, informs that men of that era had no language to describe. Unit histories record that soldiers often did far more to assist civilians than strict orders or military necessity demanded, suggesting a capacity for humanity that persisted even in the dehumanizing environment of urban combat. The underground tunnel systems of Aachen become, ironically, the salvation for many civilians who might otherwise have perished under bombardment or starvation. These tunnels, some dating back centuries and built for purposes now forgotten, others constructed during the Nazi period for air defense or military purposes, create networks of protected space beneath the streets where people can move, hide, and find water sources tapped from underground aquifers. Some tunnels connect to centuries-old fortifications, to Roman-era structures beneath the cathedral and medieval buildings, creating a subterranean geography known to long-time residents, but often a mystery to German soldiers and American liberators alike. Locals navigate these tunnels by memory and touch in absolute darkness, using them to access areas where supplies might be found or to move away from the most intense bombardment. American soldiers eventually discover these tunnel networks and use them tactically, moving troops underground to attack German positions from unexpected angles. But first, they must extract civilians who have taken shelter there. The process of clearing tunnels of civilians involves slow, careful movement through spaces so narrow that people must crouch or crawl, with guides who know the passages leading soldiers and medical personnel through the darkness toward pockets of sheltering civilians. In some cases, civilians have been underground so long and have adapted so completely to the darkness that bringing them to the surface becomes as traumatic in its own way as any other aspect of their ordeal. The air in the deepest tunnels becomes so poor that people barely have energy to move, and rescue operations sometimes involve carrying unconscious or semi-conscious civilians through passages where the rescuer and the rescued both barely fit. The question of collaboration and the possibility that some shelters harbored German soldiers or Nazi officials adds another layer of complexity and moral ambiguity to the civilian rescue operations. Some civilians, particularly ardent Nazis or members of the party apparatus, shelter alongside ordinary Germans and Europeans caught in Aachen. American soldiers and civil affairs personnel must somehow distinguish between genuine civilians in need of protection and potential security threats, a task made nearly impossible by fear, language barriers, and the fog of war. A few instances occur where German soldiers, disguised as civilians or sheltering in civilian areas, are discovered and must be removed or detained, creating incidents where civilians die in crossfire or through misunderstanding. The Americans, motivated by pragmatism, if not always idealism, generally choose to treat all who emerge from shelters as civilians first, unless positive identification proves otherwise, understanding that executing innocent people in the name of security serves no strategic purpose and violates the Geneva Conventions that even World War II combatants theoretically respect. This pragmatic humanism protects most civilians and prevents what might otherwise have become atrocities, though it also allows a small number of war criminals to slip through and escape justice. The moral complexities are rarely satisfying. Some guilty parties avoid accountability, some innocent people are detained or treated with suspicion, and the certainty that perfect justice is impossible creates a kind of moral resignation among those charged with determining who deserves protection and who does not. The distribution of food and water to civilians becomes a central preoccupation for American units advancing through Aachen, and the logistics of trying to feed thousands of people while also supplying combat troops strains already stretched supply lines. American soldiers share rations, sea rations designed for combat troops, with high caloric density and long shelf life, but flavors that most civilians find objectionable. Yet these rations represent abundance compared to what civilians have eaten in weeks of siege, and the very fact that they are refused sometimes, due to cultural preferences or suspicions about food offered by occupiers, demonstrates a recovery of normal human psychology. Medics recommend that starving civilians not be given too much food too quickly, as their digestive systems have adapted to minimal intake and large meals risk causing dangerous reactions. American authorities, lacking adequate supplies specifically designed for civilian relief, improvise by requisitioning food from German military stocks, from Dutch and Belgian supplies captured along the way, or from Red Cross supplies intended for prisoners of war that are repurposed for civilian use. The political and legal complications of feeding enemy civilians, people whose country attacked the Americans less than 5 years prior, are generally subordinated to the immediate humanitarian imperative, though some officers do express concerns about the resources diverted from military operations. Water distribution systems in Aachen are completely compromised, with pipes broken by bombardment and contamination from sewage and decay making well water dangerous. Americans create temporary water distribution points where civilians can collect drinking water in bottles and containers, though the quantities available are often inadequate for the population needing it. The combination of inadequate food and water, provided only days into what has been weeks of deprivation, cannot fully restore people ravaged by starvation and thirst, but represents the first meaningful assistance many receive since sheltering underground. As the battle's intensity finally begins to diminish in early November, the full humanitarian cost becomes visible in ways that earlier stages of the conflict obscured. Mass burial sites become necessary, as decomposing bodies accumulate faster than they can be processed through normal channels. American quartermaster units, TAS Aachen was transforming. What had begun as a disciplined military withdrawal was hardening into something far more sinister and intractable. By the final week of October, as American forces methodically advanced through the rubble-strewn streets, the nature of German resistance fundamentally shifted. It was no longer simply soldiers fighting to delay an inevitable advance. Instead, a peculiar and terrible alchemy was taking hold within the collapsing garrison, a fusion of military desperation, ideological fanaticism, and systematic terror that would bind defenders to their positions far beyond the point of rational military calculation. The remaining German commanders understood with absolute clarity that their situation was mathematically hopeless. Yet they would not, could not, simply surrender. The orders from Berlin, transmitted through Hitler's fractured command structure, were unambiguous. Aachen would be held to the last man, to the last cartridge, until total annihilation. This directive, disconnected entirely from strategic reality, became the framework within which thousands of German soldiers would waste their final days. Colonel Gerhard Wilk remained the nominal commander of German forces in Aachen, yet by late October, his authority existed in a precarious tension with the ideological enforcers embedded throughout the garrison. SS officers and Nazi Party officials had been positioned within Wehrmacht units, specifically to ensure compliance with Hitler's catastrophic orders. These men were not there as subordinates to Wilk's military judgment. They were there to guarantee that no unauthorized retreat would occur, that no negotiations would be entertained, that surrender would be treated not as an option, but as an act of treason, punishable by execution. The threat was explicit and immediate. Soldiers who questioned orders, who expressed desire to withdraw, who suggested that further resistance was futile, these men faced summary execution by firing squad or bullet to the back of the skull. The result was a garrison held together not by hope or strategic purpose, but by sheer terror. Officers and NCOs who might have otherwise sought an honorable capitulation found themselves trapped between two impossible choices: continued resistance in a war they had already lost, or bullet wounds administered by their own comrades. This coercive machinery, so characteristic of the Nazi regime in its final months, prevented the rapid collapse that American commanders had anticipated. The Germans adapted their tactical approach to the urban environment with considerable skill despite their deteriorating situation. Rather than holding continuous lines, German defenders established a series of strongpoints and defensive positions connected by covered routes and prepared firing zones. When American forces pushed into a sector, Germans would fall back to predetermined secondary positions, extracting maximum casualties from the advancing Americans while preserving their own combat strength. These withdrawals were controlled and coordinated, executed under direct orders with specific objectives. German engineers had fortified buildings throughout Aachen's interior, creating interlocking fields of fire and preparing rubble heaps as firing positions. Basements and cellars were connected by tunnels or breached walls, allowing defenders to move unseen between positions. The complexity of these arrangements meant that American units attacking what appeared to be a single building often discovered that it connected to a network of defensive positions spanning entire city blocks. The Germans were buying time through these tactics, and they understood fully that time was a luxury they could not afford. Yet they bought it nonetheless, at terrible cost to themselves and the Americans pressing against them. American soldiers advancing through Aachen's shattered streets encountered something grimly unfamiliar in their experience of the European campaign. German forces were not retreating in disarray or surrendering in growing numbers, as they had increasingly done across France after the Normandy breakout. Instead, they were fighting with renewed intensity, conducting counterattacks against American positions, and resisting with a ferocity that suggested fanaticism rather than professional soldiering. Officers leading these efforts seemed to operate under the assumption that surrender was literally not an option. American intelligence reports began noting the presence of SS fanatics and Nazi Party officials moving through German defensive positions, apparently enforcing discipline through threats and executions. Captured German soldiers, when interviewed, spoke of standing on their positions not because they believed in any possibility of victory, but because refusing to do so meant death at the hands of their own side. This revelation shocked many American commanders, who had grown accustomed to rational adversaries, who understood when a position was untenable, and who would negotiate accordingly. Aachen introduced them to the reality of Nazi regime terror, imposed even on its own forces, a system where military logic had been entirely superseded by ideological compulsion. Counterattacks, though small in scale and inevitably repulsed, became a feature of the German defense that surprised American tactical planners. When American units captured a street intersection or secured a district, German forces would sometimes mount immediate attempts to retake the ground. These were not desperate suicide charges but organized assaults with supporting fire, clearly planned in advance and executed with tactical competence. German defenders would concentrate on vulnerable points in American positions, exploit gaps in the American lines, and strike with surprising coordination given the chaos surrounding them. These counterattacks rarely succeeded in permanently retaking lost territory, but they inflicted casualties on American forces, disrupted American consolidation of gains, and required American commanders to commit additional reserves to maintain their advance. More significantly, they demonstrated that the German garrison, far from collapsing into passive defense, was attempting to seize tactical initiative wherever possible. These efforts came at tremendous cost to German strength, yet the ideological imperative overrode all considerations of resource conservation or casualty prevention. Every man killed in a counterattack was a man unavailable for defense when American pressure continued. Yet still the orders came to counterattack, and still German soldiers, whether from conviction or coercion, obeyed them. The role of Nazi fanatics in maintaining German resistance cannot be overstated or moralized away in retrospect. It was simply a brutal fact of the garrison's behavior. These were not men conducting ordinary military operations according to professional norms. They were instruments of the Nazi state enforcing its irrational demands through threats, coercion, and murder. German deserters from Aachen, captured by American forces or who made their way through German lines, described escaping not from American fire, but from execution details organized by SS personnel. The story repeated often enough that American intelligence officers recognized it as something beyond individual anecdote. Soldiers who attempted to surrender themselves to Americans or who proposed discussion of terms faced immediate consequences within German ranks. This created a paradox particularly cruel for ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers caught in the garrison. They had lost any realistic hope of victory weeks earlier, possibly months earlier, yet surrender meant either death from American fire or death from their own commanders. The only path to survival, however temporary, lay in continued fighting. This was not an environment that produced rational decision-making or recognition of military realities. It produced instead a grinding, attrition-based resistance divorced entirely from any achievable objective except delay. The American response to this hardened resistance evolved across late October as commanders grasped that they faced not a conventional military problem, but rather a siege situation requiring indefinite commitment of forces and resources. Reinforcements were called forward to thicken American lines and enable continuous pressure on German positions without pause. Additional artillery batteries were wheeled into position, and American air support was maintained at maximum intensity despite the presence of trapped civilians in the city. American commanders had initially hoped to minimize collateral damage and civilian casualties, but as the battle extended and German resistance intensified, such humanitarian concerns were increasingly subordinated to military necessity. The Americans shifted tactics toward overwhelming firepower applied systematically to German strongpoints, regardless of the historic or civilian structures involved. Tanks were pressed into close support of infantry, and engineers with flamethrowers were brought forward to clear particularly stubborn defensive positions. This escalation transformed Aachen from a rapid tactical problem into a grinding attritional siege, in which American material superiority would be deployed without restraint. German defenders, understanding this shift, nonetheless persisted in their resistance, sustained by terror and coercion rather than any belief in eventual success. The Wehrmacht officers who commanded German units in Aachen faced an extraordinary moral and professional dilemma that has often been overlooked in historical accounts focused on the broader strategic collapse of Nazi Germany. These were men trained in conventional military conduct who now served under orders that violated every principle of rational military strategy. They understood, as did their soldiers, that Aachen's continued resistance benefited no one except the Nazi ideology that had already destroyed their nation. Yet they could not simply order their men to lay down arms and walk out of the city. To do so meant death sentences for themselves and potentially for large numbers of their troops who might be identified as having participated in unauthorized surrender. The coercive apparatus constructed around them prevented the kind of rational command decisions that professional officers would normally make. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a system that compelled them to continue throwing men and resources into a fight they had already lost. Some officers, like Wilk himself, would later justify their continued resistance as having been necessary to preserve what troops they could, and to eventually extract an honorable surrender. Others simply complied with orders, finding refuge in the justification that they were soldiers bound to obey commands from higher authority. Whatever their personal thoughts or reservations, the result remained constant: continued resistance that served no purpose except to prolong suffering on both sides. The ideological dimension of German resistance at Aachen cannot be separated from the military facts of the garrison's struggle. The Nazi regime had spent over a decade inculcating its soldiers with particular beliefs about honor, sacrifice, and the necessity of fighting to the final moment rather than accepting surrender. The Hitler Youth conscripts within the garrison, some barely old enough to shave, had been shaped entirely by Nazi educational philosophy and propaganda. They possessed no reference point for rational military conduct divorced from Nazi ideology. Their understanding of what it meant to be a German soldier had been formed by regime schools, Hitler Youth organizations, and military training that emphasized ideological purity alongside tactical instruction. These young men, thrown into urban combat in a city that had already been largely destroyed, fought with a fervor that sometimes exceeded that of older Wehrmacht professionals. Their fanatic resistance was partly choice and partly the product of systematic indoctrination over years of their formative years. The fact that many of them were coerced by threat of execution does not negate the ideological framework that had made them susceptible to such manipulation in the first place. The system fed on itself. Those who had been indoctrinated to believe in Nazi values were most likely to execute those who wavered in their commitment. American soldiers advancing into Aachen's interior during late October reported encounters with German defenders who seemed detached from any conventional military calculation. Some appeared listless, trapped in defensive positions with minimal ammunition and no realistic prospect of relief or reinforcement. Others displayed aggressive determination and fought with visible anger. The variety of psychological states reflected the extreme stress that the garrison was under and the different ways individual soldiers processed an impossible situation. Some fell back on training and professionalism, doing their duty as soldiers regardless of the futility involved. Others channeled their fear into aggression, fighting harder precisely because surrender seemed unavailable. Still others appeared to accept that they would die and simply delayed their death for as long as possible, hoping that by some miracle circumstances might change. American interrogators and battlefield observers noted that German prisoners often expressed relief at being captured, having finally escaped the coercive system that bound them. This was not the behavior of soldiers fighting for a cause they believed in, but rather of men compelled to continue participating in violence by forces beyond their control. The psychological toll of this situation infected the entire garrison, creating an atmosphere of desperation and paranoia that only intensified as the battle progressed. The question of why the garrison did not simply mutiny or surrender en masse despite the threat of execution has troubled historians who seek to understand the behavior of ordinary soldiers under Nazi command. The answer appears to involve multiple reinforcing factors working in concert. The threat of execution was real and immediate rather than theoretical. Officers and NCOs knew their own names, and faces would be known to SS fanatics if they participated in unauthorized surrender. Small group cohesion meant that soldiers were reluctant to betray their comrades or NCOs who had treated them decently, even if the larger institutional framework was corrupt. German military culture had emphasized duty and obedience, far beyond what democratic armies typically demand. The compartmentalization of information meant that many soldiers did not fully understand the complete strategic situation or the extent of the broader German collapse. The psychology of combat itself tends to bind soldiers to the unit and moment, reducing long-term strategic calculations to immediate tactical concerns. All of these factors, layered atop one another, created a system resistant to collapse despite the obvious futility of continued resistance. German defenders in Aachen continued fighting not because they believed in ultimate victory, or even in the necessity of their resistance from any rational military perspective. They continued fighting because the coercive machinery of the Nazi state, even in its death throes, remained powerful enough to compel compliance. Yet within this system of coercion and control, cracks were visible to those paying attention. German soldiers who managed to escape Aachen and reach American lines spoke of conversations within the garrison about the pointlessness of continued resistance. Officers were known to discuss quietly among themselves the necessity of eventually seeking terms, even if such discussion was treason under Nazi law. Some German soldiers deliberately slowed their firing rates or aimed high to minimize casualties while maintaining the appearance of resistance. The system of terror and coercion was comprehensive, but it was not perfect, and within any system of sufficient scope, there will be individuals attempting to subvert it in small ways. These acts of quiet resistance, invisible to military statistics and casualty counts, represented the persistence of individual moral agency even under totalitarian coercion. They did not stop the fighting or end the siege, but they represented a form of internal opposition that foreshadowed the final collapse of German discipline that would occur when organized command structure finally disintegrated completely. The ideological last stand that Aachen represented was not unquestioned within the garrison. Instead, it was maintained through force and fear against the growing recognition among German soldiers that their situation was beyond recovery. The hardening of German resistance during late October 1944 thus represented not a renewal of genuine fighting capability, but rather the intensification of coercive mechanisms imposed on a garrison that understood its own defeat with absolute clarity. Colonel Wilk and his subordinate officers presided over forces held together by terror, ideology, and the psychological weight of military discipline, rather than by hope or belief in eventual success. The Americans advancing through Aachen's ruins encountered soldiers fighting with intensity that had nothing to do with confidence in victory and everything to do with the inescapable pressure of coercive command and the fear of execution from their own side. This represented a particularly tragic chapter in the broader story of the European war's final months, when Nazi regime authority remained capable of compelling resistance even as the material and strategic situation made such resistance meaningless. The continuation of the battle beyond any rational military calculation imposed immense suffering on the remaining civilian population, on American soldiers pressing through the ruins, and on German soldiers who had little choice but to comply with orders they understood to be suicidal. The battle would continue for weeks yet, grinding forward through November, but the character of German resistance was already established. Fanatical, coercive, and ultimately doomed to collapse, not when military logic demanded it, but when the actual machinery of command finally disintegrated under the weight of military defeat. In the first weeks of October, as American infantry pressed deeper into Aachen's outer districts, a troubling reality began to crystallize in the minds of senior commanders. The city was not collapsing. The Germans were not wavering. What had been anticipated as a rapid thrust through urban streets, a matter of days, perhaps a week at most, was metamorphosing into something far more protracted and costly. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group from his headquarters some distance to the rear, received reports that unsettled his calculations. Colonel Gerhard Wilkes' refusal of the surrender ultimatum on the 9th of October had closed a door that Bradley had hoped would remain open. The American advance, which had moved with such spectacular momentum across France, suddenly encountered the immovable object of fanatical German resistance in an urban setting where speed and maneuver offered no advantage. Bradley and his subordinates, including General Courtney Hodges of the First Army and the corps commanders operating within the city's perimeter, faced a choice that would reshape the entire campaign. They could accept a prolonged siege that might stretch into November or beyond, or they could throw enormous resources at the problem in an attempt to accelerate the outcome through overwhelming force. The American military possessed the capacity for overwhelming force, and in the middle of October, the decision was made to employ it without restraint. Additional divisions were redirected toward Aachen from other sectors of the front, reinforcing the assault forces already engaged in the grinding work of house-to-house combat. Fresh artillery battalions were wheeled into positions around the city's perimeter, adding their tubes to the already thunderous bombardment that had become the signature of the operation. Tank companies and Sherman armored vehicles, which had initially been held in reserve due to concerns about their effectiveness in dense urban terrain, were now committed to the assault in greater numbers, providing mobile firepower and protection for the infantry units struggling through the rubble. These reinforcements represented a fundamental shift in American strategy. Rather than attempting to economize resources and preserve momentum for the broader advance toward the Rhine and ultimately Berlin, American commanders had decided to invest whatever it took to break Aachen's resistance and thereby deny the Germans the psychological victory of a successful defense. This reorientation toward resource-intensive warfare reflected both the realities on the ground and the changing calculus of the campaign as a whole. American logistical capabilities, though stretched by the rapid advance across France, remained formidable compared to German capacity. Supply lines extending back to the invasion beaches and European ports could sustain intensive operations far longer than German supply lines could support sustained resistance. Ammunition was plentiful, replacement troops were available, medical support was comprehensive. What the Americans had initially lacked was not resources but patience, a willingness to conduct a methodical siege when all prior experience in Europe suggested that rapid breakthrough and exploitation remained possible. But patience, it became clear, was exactly what Aachen demanded. The shift toward patience was not, however, accompanied by a reduction in aggression. Rather, the American assault became more carefully orchestrated, more deliberately methodical, but no less determined to overwhelm German defenses through a combination of firepower, manpower, and tactical adaptation. The integration of armor into urban combat operations presented commanders with novel tactical problems that required experimental solutions developed in real time. Shermans and other medium tanks were vulnerable in narrow streets where German anti-tank teams could ambush them from windows and rubble piles, yet their firepower could suppress German defenders and protect infantry advances if properly coordinated. American armor commanders began working more closely with infantry officers to develop tactics in which tanks would advance in support of dismounted troops rather than independently. Tank guns were used to pulverize buildings suspected of harboring German defenders, blasting openings through walls to allow infantry to move sideways through structures rather than advancing down exposed streets. Smaller tank destroyers and self-propelled guns were positioned to cover street intersections and provide overwatch for advancing platoons. These innovations emerged not from doctrinal manuals, but from the practical necessities of urban warfare, developed by officers and sergeants learning through bitter experience what worked and what resulted in needless casualties. Engineering units and support troops, often overlooked in narratives focused on frontline combat, became increasingly essential to American tactical adaptation. Combat engineers employed explosives to demolish buildings selected as German strongpoints, collapsing structures that would otherwise have required long sieges to clear room by room. Flamethrower teams, organized into dedicated squads and supported by infantry providing rifle cover, were employed against fortified positions where conventional assault would be prohibitively expensive in lives. Smoke generators laid screens of protective obscuration, allowing American troops to move across exposed areas with reduced casualties from German small arms fire. Engineer platoons worked frantically to clear rubble from streets, to allow vehicle passage, and to construct improvised ramps and crossings over barriers and anti-tank obstacles. Medics and stretcher bearers operated in closer proximity to the front lines than in conventional warfare, reducing delays in treatment of wounded and improving survival rates. The entire American logistical apparatus supplied troops, ammunition handlers, water carriers, maintenance personnel, adapted to the unique demands of urban siege warfare, where lines were fluid and supply vehicles operated under regular German fire. Command and control mechanisms also underwent rapid evolution as American officers developed techniques for coordinating complex operations in an environment where vision was restricted and communication difficult. Radio networks that functioned adequately for mobile warfare became strained by the density of operations in urban terrain, where every block represented a potential command post, and every building could conceal a German observer. Company and platoon officers developed more elaborate hand signal systems and began relying more heavily on verbal briefings conducted before operations commenced, rather than attempting to adjust plans through radio communication during the assault. Coordination between artillery support and ground forces became more intricate, with forward observers working in even closer proximity to assaulting infantry to call in fire support on German positions immediately ahead of advancing troops. Target folders were prepared for anticipated strongpoints, with fire missions pre-planned to strike known or suspected German defensive positions at predetermined times. This shift toward more detailed pre-planning, though sometimes criticized as reducing flexibility, actually improved coordination and reduced instances of friendly fire incidents that plagued operations where communication was less deliberate. The psychological and physical toll of urban combat in the context of extended siege operations became a focus of American command attention in ways it might not have been had the battle remained brief. Soldiers engaged in close quarters fighting against determined opponents experienced trauma and exhaustion that accumulated day by day as the operations stretched on without apparent end. Rotation policies, whereby units would be pulled from the line after a specified period of intense combat to allow rest and reconstitution, became increasingly difficult to implement when reinforcing divisions and replacement troops were committed piecemeal to the assault rather than held in reserve. Medical officers reported growing numbers of combat fatigue cases, soldiers who had simply reached the limit of their psychological capacity to function under continuous stress and danger. In response, American commanders began organizing relief operations more systematically, rotating companies and battalions out of the line when tactically feasible, and ensuring that soldiers received adequate rest, food, and medical attention. The recognition that infantry morale could be restored through adequate rest and replacement of losses led to greater emphasis on maintaining unit cohesion and preventing the wholesale replacement of depleted units by wholesale new formations that lacked teamwork and experience together. The shift from rapid advance doctrine to methodical siege tactics also represented a fundamental adjustment in how American commanders understood the war itself. In the heady days of late August and early September, when German defenses had collapsed and American spearheads seemed poised to race toward Berlin, there had been genuine belief among some planners that the war in Europe might be concluded before the year ended. The resistance at Aachen, though it involved only one German garrison, suggested a profoundly different future. If the Germans would defend a single city with such determination despite obvious strategic defeat, what would they do when defending the Rhineland, the Ruhr industrial basin, and ultimately German territory itself? The answer, implicit in the events at Aachen, was that they would fight with similar desperation, prolonging the war and multiplying casualties on both sides. This realization compelled American commanders to think in terms of attrition warfare rather than maneuver warfare, to calculate operations in terms of how much firepower would be required to overcome entrenched enemy positions, and to accept that the road to Berlin would be measured not in weeks, but in months of grinding, expensive combat. Resource allocation across the entire Western Front reflected this new understanding. While the assault on Aachen continued and intensified, American planners were simultaneously preparing for expanded operations along the entire front as winter approached. This meant that additional divisions being committed to Aachen represented not unlimited reinforcement, but rather a portion of available reserves. The requirement to maintain defensive lines elsewhere, to protect flanks and supply routes, and to prepare for potential German counteroffensive operations meant that even the commitment of additional divisions to Aachen involved difficult trade-offs. General Bernard Montgomery's British and Canadian forces were simultaneously engaged in their own costly battles in the Netherlands, where similar urban resistance delayed Allied progress. The broad American strategy across northwestern Europe thus involved accepting multiple protracted operations rather than concentrating overwhelming force at a single point. Aachen received substantial reinforcement, but not the unlimited reinforcement that might have allowed American forces to achieve complete encirclement and annihilation of the German garrison without the protracted siege that actually ensued. The integration of air power into the siege operations represented another dimension of American tactical adaptation and resource commitment. Tactical air forces that had previously operated in fluid support of rapidly advancing armies now turned their attention to close air support for ground forces locked in urban combat. Fighter bombers and medium bombers struck targets identified by forward air controllers operating with ground units, though the dangers of friendly fire incidents in urban terrain made these operations considerably more complex and dangerous than air support in open country. Strategic bombers, though not ideally suited to precision targeting in urban areas, were sometimes employed against identified German positions, adding enormous destruction to the already devastated cityscape. The coordination between air and ground forces, always challenging, became even more so when targets were measured in blocks and individual buildings rather than geographic features and road networks. These operations consumed vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and aircraft maintenance, representing an enormous commitment of American resources to the single objective of breaking German resistance at Aachen. The fact that this commitment was made and sustained through October demonstrates how completely American military leadership had accepted that the rapid breakthrough phase of the campaign had ended and a long war of attrition had begun. By the final weeks of October, the tempo of American operations had reached a rhythm that would characterize the campaign until German capitulation in May. This rhythm involved methodical advances through prepared defensive positions, accompanied by massive firepower support, deliberate consolidation of gains, and preparation for the next phase of operations. Tank and infantry coordination had evolved to the point where armor and infantry operated as unified tactical teams rather than separate arms. Engineer support had become routinized and integrated into all major operations. Artillery support was pre-planned but flexible, capable of rapid adjustment to changing circumstances on the ground. Logistical systems had adapted to the unique demands of urban warfare, where supply routes were subject to German harassment and supply depots could not be established in exposed locations. Medical evacuation procedures had been refined to move wounded soldiers from the front lines to aid stations and hospital facilities with minimum delay. All these adaptations, taken individually, represented incremental improvements in American military effectiveness. Taken together, they represented a transformation of American military capabilities from those of a rapid maneuver army to those of a methodical siege army capable of sustaining complex operations in unfavorable terrain against a determined enemy. The human dimensions of this adaptation extended well beyond tactical and logistical adjustments. Officers learned to inspire troops whose exhaustion mounted daily and whose morale was strained by the apparent endlessness of the fighting. Sergeants developed techniques for maintaining discipline and cohesion in units depleted by casualties and whose survivors were approaching the psychological limits of endurance. Individual soldiers adapted to circumstances they had never anticipated, discovering reserves of courage and determination they had not previously known they possessed. Medics and aid station personnel confronted catastrophic wounds and the knowledge that their modest capabilities could not save everyone, forcing them to make terrible choices about whom to treat first and whom to comfort as they died. The adaptation of the American military to urban warfare was thus fundamentally human as well as tactical and logistical, a collective adjustment by hundreds of thousands of individuals to circumstances that demanded far more from them than they had anticipated giving. As November approached, the American assault on Aachen had become something substantially different from the rapid breakthrough operation that commanders had envisioned in early October. The initial assumption that the city would fall within days had been replaced by recognition that the operation would extend deep into autumn and that the costs would be measured in thousands of casualties on both sides. The American military had proven capable of reorganizing itself and reorienting its operations toward urban siege warfare. But this transformation had not been rapid or painless. The commitment of additional divisions, artillery, armor, and air power to Aachen represented both the resources available to American commanders and their determination to achieve victory regardless of cost. Whether this adaptation would prove sufficient to break German resistance before the onset of severe winter weather remained an open question as American forces continued their methodical advance through Aachen's devastated streets. The days that followed the initial American penetration into Aachen's streets marked a fundamental shift in the battle's character. What had begun as a siege was now becoming an execution. By the final week of October, American forces had completed a ring around the entire city, sealing shut the only remaining gaps through which supplies or reinforcements might have trickled in. The First Army's divisions, working in coordinated movements despite the chaos of urban combat, had methodically pushed German defenders back toward the city center block by block, compressing them into an ever-shrinking pocket of resistance. Every American advance meant fewer routes available to the Germans, fewer places to establish new defensive lines, fewer options for the men fighting in Aachen's rubble. The Wehrmacht garrison discovered that the city they had been ordered to hold as a fortress had instead become their cage. The mathematics of Aachen's collapse were brutally straightforward. The German garrison had begun the siege numbering approximately 5,000 men, though by late October, casualties and the redeployment of units elsewhere had reduced their effective strength significantly. The American forces arrayed against them numbered in the tens of thousands and continued to grow as General Hodges fed additional divisions into the grinding urban assault. German soldiers peering through the dust and smoke could see the American forces encroaching from every direction, sense the pressure mounting with each passing day, understand with grim clarity that no relief was coming. Hitler's orders from his distant headquarters meant nothing to hungry men rationing their last rounds of ammunition, nothing to wounded soldiers with no hope of evacuation, nothing to commanders watching their positions collapse around them. Hunger became as much a weapon in Aachen as American artillery. The encirclement meant that the carefully hoarded supply caches accumulated before the siege had begun would now have to sustain the garrison indefinitely, a mathematical impossibility that every quartermaster officer could calculate.